Hello and welcome everyone back to History After Dark. Tonight we're looking at the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, and we are examining the causes of the war and also a lot of the issues that go into its resolution. So joining me this evening are Sean Chick and Michael Kraemer. Gentlemen, how are we doing this evening?
Well, hello. I'm doing well. How about you guys?
Yeah,
Hanging.
I'm all right, man. I got a lot of stuff done this week, Started up I finally started I finished an article on Don Carlos Buell and they really liked it, so I submitted that. And what else we have here? I got back to the second Petersburg volume, so my plan is to submit it in June. And then volume 3 is pretty well along anyway, so that'll be submitted in July. And I plan to spend a lot of this summer reading and writing because it looks like we have a pretty dead one. Unfortunately, I'm working for a company where I can get some decent work in, but I'm going to be doing a lot of writing this summer, which means this summer I'm be open for a lot of streams. Um, but beyond that, I did have a few things I wanted to mention right quick before we got into Mexico. Um, I did want to mention that Derek, we were talking about Buell, and I forgot to mention on the stream, I believe, that Buell is buried next to Rush Limbaugh.
Oh, yeah, I think you told me that right after we went off the air last time.
Yeah, I was like, I kept being like, what did I forget to say? And I didn't expect that. So I'm going to this guy. When I went to Missouri for the Civil War talk there about a year and a half ago, this guy drove me around Bellefontaine Cemetery, which has lots of Civil War personalities buried there. A lot of generals like A.P. Stewart, Madison Miller, Sterling Price, and Don Carlos Buell. We get to Buell's tomb. It's big. It's kind of like Buell. It's kind of simple but like imposing in its own way. And then I look over to the right, and there's Rush Limbaugh's grave. Just like with only a few feet spacing them off, and they're kind of in an odd spot. I don't remember seeing many, if any, other tombs around there. So before Limbaugh got buried there, Buell was kind of like off to his own on the road. And I don't know how Limbaugh got that spot. I'm pretty certain Rush Limbaugh was not a Don Carlos Buell aficionado, though.
Well, I mean, I guess it's
Right?
possible, but also it's probably the way Nicolas Cage got his pyramid.
No, the Nicolas Cage pyramid is a little different. It's surrounded by other tombs, and he's picked a spot that had a decent amount of space overall. So I guess maybe that. Yeah, I guess maybe in that way. But
No,
like
what I meant is
Nicolas
that there
Cage
was a
was there was
cash
a lot of tombs
transaction.
around it. Yeah, well, he bribed him anyway.
Yeah.
But the Limbaugh one is just it's off a little bit away from Buell. It's a bit of an odd spot in that regard. Um, I guess maybe he did spend a lot of money to be buried at that spot. It also makes me wonder why Buell is at that spot in particular. I was also a little surprised that Buell was buried in St. Louis, Missouri, because he's mostly associated with Ohio and Kentucky. That's where he spent most of his life.
Hmm.
Um, Part of me's even wondering why he didn't get buried at Shiloh because he was so important to the battlefield being created. And I did have one other fun announcement for everybody because, one of my little things on here is the Henry Halleck conspiracy theory. And I found a fun one for you. I kept wondering why in the hell in 1864, did they give General Canby this major command west of the Mississippi? So Canby was in charge of a military division. So the Union organization at this time is you have divisions, and then under those are departments. So he's in command of the Union Army in Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and the Gulf, Texas, and the Gulf Coast in general. And Canby, I think he was only a commander in one battle, which he lost. Even though the New Mexico campaign was a Union victory, he'd been spent almost all of 1863 riding a desk. And I kept wondering, how did he get this position? Also, he wasn't like that close to Halleck or anything, although Halleck thought kind of well about him. Here's what happened. So, Grant liked Canby. He takes over commander of the army. He actually says, "Hey, I want to give Canby this job." And then Canby, who's like kind of working under Halleck goes, "Oh, his health's not great. He can't do that. He wants him nearby." And then suddenly, Grant and other guys say, "Maybe we should replace Halleck with Canby." Within a week of that rumor happening, Canby is then given the command by Halleck.
Wow. That's quite a coincidence, huh?
Quite a coincidence. And also the thing I'm reading, I was reading about I got this Canby biography. I was looking through it because I'm going to be working on I'm co-authoring a book on the Mobile campaign and Wilson's raid. And the author's going into like, wait, so suddenly before Canby was too sick to take up a minor command, but now you can give him one of the biggest commands in the Union Army magically.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe his health changed that week, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And last but not least, maybe that guy Autumn Shen's getting better for me, man. I actually saw 2 videos of his. I thought they were decent. So maybe he's gotten better over the years. People do change.
Yeah.
So
Well, there you go.
one of them was on the outlaw Josie Wales. But anyway, that's pretty much all I got for announcements. Oh, and last but not least, still have the GoFundMe going. My bank account's all clear, so anything given will contribute to the maps. I just started because the money is now clearing to the bank account and everything. We just finished the first map of Volume 2 a few days ago. So
Nice.
that's ongoing. Everything is good, and anybody who contributes, once again, you'll get a notice in the in Volume 3. So everybody, that's it for me. Thank you.
And the link is in the description, by the way.
Yes, in the description, everybody.
All right. So, I guess we need to figure out where we want to begin in terms of the deeper causes of the Mexican War. So, where would the kind of jumping off point be?
So I have a joke jumping off point, and then I have a real jumping off point. If y'all wanna,
Oh yeah,
let me jump.
I'm here for the I'm here for the lulls.
Okay, well, our story begins in around 1510 with the conquest of Tenochtitlan by Hernan Cortez. The reason why our story begins then, and I will not go into the conquest of the Aztec Empire, is because that's how horses arrive in North America.
Mm.
And horses are incredibly important to understanding the West and understanding the Spanish Empire and eventually Mexico, and how the Spanish Empire and Mexico fail to control their northern provinces, which will eventually become part of the United States. And one of the reasons why Mexico is vulnerable to invasion by the United States is because they don't control most of their northern territory. So I thought it'd be sort of interesting to sort of begin this stream on the U.S. on the U.S.-Mexico War to do a little plug for Native American history and why it matters. Because if any of you ever are interested in Native American history, take a look at the book The Comanche Empire by Pekka Hamalainen. And because basically what Hamalainen finds is that there is a massive indigenous nation called the Comanches. The Comanches today live in Oklahoma, and the Comanches build a very large and powerful polity using horsepower in the 1700s, using horses to raid, in order to get more horses, to then hunt buffalo, to then project military power, and create large trade agreements from basically the northern Rockies all the way down to modern-day northern Mexico. And so from basically 1780 to past the Mexican-American War, to all the way up to about the 1850s, into the early 1860s, the Comanche raiders are raiding down into northern Mexico, and destroying ranches, stealing cattle, stealing horses, and effectively power projecting into Mexican territory. And that's what's happening in the early 1800s when the United States is expanding west. And so why is Texas eventually populated by a bunch of American settlers? Well, it's because in the 1790s and the early 1800s, Comanche raiders were completely destroying rancherias, or Spanish and then Mexican rancherias, and haciendas in Texas. They could not control their own territory in Texas, because effectively the Comanche Empire was power projecting throughout all of the northern possessions of Mexico and the Spanish Empire. And this is the case sort of in the modern West and Texas. This is New Mexico. So the Spanish and then after the Mexican Revolution, the Mexico have settlements in modern day New Mexico, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and basically every single year, Comanche raiders will come to these places and kind of extort the local population for trade goods, for horses, sometimes for slaves. There's actually a slave trade here as well. And the Comanche Empire effectively treats New Mexico as a vassal state. And so this like the whole reason why American settlers are originally invited by the Mexican government in the 1820s and 1830s, well, 1810s and 1820s rather, into Texas, is to effectively use American settlers as a bulwark to protect Mexico from Comanche raids. Which I think is sort of fascinating origin story to this war, right? And so Sean, you said you had something on buffer states in Spain, and I think this is a good time for it, because Texas effectively is created as a buffer state for the Republic of Mexico, and this buffer state will eventually try to declare its own independence for cultural and economic and frankly for reasons of supporting slavery as well. So we can kind of pick up the story there, but I wanted to sort of mention this larger context of Native American history, because it's really important to understanding why there's even a Mexican American War.
Yeah, the Comanche raids are a crucial one for Texas. There had been, going a bit east, going to Louisiana, a Spanish policy of having some kind of buffer state against the British. So 1762, 7 Years' War. It's not officially over, but there's pretty much no fighting in 1763. So it's wrapping up. And the Spanish got involved in the war and did very poorly. And the British are now going to get Florida. At this point, the French are losing Canada, and they're looking at this and going, there's no reason to keep Louisiana, this vast territory that we claimed but has been underdeveloped for a lot of reasons. The two crucial ones, I would say, for the French Louisiana being underdeveloped was, first off, they couldn't really turn a profit here. They tried to grow tobacco and indigo. Neither really grows well in this area. So they're not turning any kind of profit. It's a drain on the economy. But this is a big one. I want to mention this because this plays into yours as well. The French couldn't defeat the Chickasaw. The French plan was to connect Louisiana to Canada through a series of native alliances and trade routes, but the Chickasaw were loyal to the British. And the French fought 2 wars against the Chickasaw. Sometimes they say 3, but we're pretty sure the 3rd war didn't actually happen. It was made up. But we know they fought 2. And one war was a definite French defeat, and the other one was a stalemate. But regardless, the French were not able to connect. And the Louisiana colony didn't really help out Canada much during the 7 Years' War. So they're like, hey, let's just give this stuff away to Spain. Spain takes up Louisiana for purely military purposes, to have a buffer between Mexico and Louisiana. Well, of course, then you have Louisiana Purchase and all the rest with that. So now you have an American power that is, you have an America that is growing, that is aggressive, and they need some kind of buffer there.
And I want to
invite these Americans over, hoping that they can develop Texas, and that provides both a buffer between America, but more importantly, like you're saying, to hold off the Comanche. As far as Texas goes, of course, they're going to try to go for independence. But one thing that's kind of a flawed idea, like how can you hang on to Texas with a bunch of Americans? And not just any Americans. You got to think of the kind of Americans also are moving to Texas. All right, like for instance, General Colonel, I think he was a colonel actually, Fannin, the one whose men were massacred at Goliad. You know where he was like a year and a half before he becomes one of the leaders of the Texas independence movement? He's in a jail in New Orleans. Right?
Huh.
So we got some rough and rowdy guys there. Also should be noted that the Mexicans who are also settling in Texas, typically between the Nuca and the Rio Grande, and how do you pronounce the other river? It starts with the end, Nucas. How do you still pronounce this one? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I've
One
always
that they
pronounced
claim as the
it
border?
Nuevas.
Nuevas River? Okay. So Nuevas River and Rio Grande, that area in particular gets settled by a lot of Mexicans. But we're not the kind of Mexicans who don't really like the government in Mexico City. Many of them were people who wanted to avoid the economic conditions there because Mexico ended slavery and ended it very aggressively. But they still had something of a form of indentured servitude as well. Anyways, so you were mentioning the reasons of keeping around the slavery. There's also a Santa Anna centralization, correct?
Yeah. I mean, he's a centralizer in terms of Mexican history because, think of Mexico as a new republic, right? And you have these different provinces, and in Mexico, they're following a lot of previous models in terms of Spanish colonization, where local elites have a lot of power, and so you often have sort of different administrations come in, and some administrations might be very the federal administrations might be tolerant of provincial elites, and others might not be. And Santa Anna is a president who's not. He's very much more of a centralizer. So he's going to come into some of these provinces which have sometimes special privileges, like Texas had an exception to allow slavery in this province, and Santana basically says, no, we're ending that. And so you're going to have to follow general Mexican law, which bans slavery.
All right. Now, Derek, you read a biography of Santa Anna, right?
I don't think I have, no.
I thought you did because you were talking to me one time about how as long as he's not fighting an American, he's actually a pretty good general or something.
Maybe I did at one point. It's been a long time if I have. I do remember reading bios of like Franco and some other figures though.
It was
And
around that time. You read like
Bolivar.
Franco, and then you had Longstreet's memoir, and
Yeah, and I read
what?
Simon Bolivar and a few others, but
Gotcha. So wait, what's the deal with so in the terms of Santa Anna, he's a centralizer. What else would y'all like to say about him?
he's a fairly charismatic figure, isn't he? I mean, he's a guy who's very good
Mhm.
at, I guess we'd call propaganda, for lack of a better term. A guy who was good at talking about Mexican patriotism.
Yeah,
So that's
he he notoriously in Texas will accept no quarter because he was taught as a young officer no quarter for rebels.
Yeah.
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 Um, and I mention this one because the Republic of Texas. Okay, so just a real brief thing on the war there. The Texas declares independence. The Mexican army that's already stationed there is rather quickly defeated. Santa Anna returns with a sizable force, surrounds the Alamo. Uh, Travis was apparently supposed to abandon the Alamo, but decided to fight it out there. The
Yeah.
Alamo falls. This is the definition of a Pyrrhic victory. Mexican casualties were very, very heavy, and this was a very, very brutal fight. All right. The handful of Americans who did surrender at the Alamo, one of which was probably David Crockett, were executed, despite pleas from some of Santana's officers not to do it. Now, Santa
Yeah.
Anna, on the one hand, was charismatic, but he was also careless with the lives of his men. I read one of his staff officers mentioned to him, "Hey, if we attack the Alamo, storm this position, we're going to lose a lot of men." And according to this officer, Santa Anna said, "What are the lives of soldiers but so many chickens?"
damn.
And after
Wow.
the battle, the same officer said, when they looked at all the casualties, American and Mexican, Santa Anna said, "Behold, the dead chickens." Yeah. And then the Mexican army continued to advance. The other one American force, the one led by Fannin, which was roughly 300 soldiers, they are surrounded and defeated at Coleto Creek, and they are eventually massacred at Goliad. And this is despite pleas from several of Santa Anna's officers saying, "Do not do this." All right, but Santa Anna's intent. He says, "You're a rebel. You die. You're not a prisoner. You get no rights. You die." And the Texas Army under Sam Houston flees. This is called like the Great Scrape. And the thing about the name of the Texas Army at this time, by the way, it's in some ways it's a very fascinating army because this is one of the armies that has stunning strengths and weaknesses. Like, discipline is poor, really poor. Their officers bicker incessantly. All right. Because all these men are also looking for political advantage, and I know that's true in a lot of wars. But the Texas High Command is a nightmare in this thing. That's one of the reasons why you had the incidents with the Alamo and Goliad in the first place. These guys are really good shots, and you get them into a fight, they show a lot of tenacity. But you got to get them into that fight. So Santa Anna chased Houston across Texas. And by this time, Santa Anna is becoming cocky, saying these Texans aren't worth anything. Houston's own men are being like, "You're a coward. You need to go out there and fight them." Well, near what is today Houston, with the Battle of San Jacinto, what happened is Santa Anna's army encamped there near a swamp. Houston attacked. His men went in yelling, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." They didn't wait to exchange fire. They overran a lightly fortified Mexican position. This is not a battle. The fighting is effectively over in 10 minutes. Mexicans suffer horrendous casualties. No doubt about it, there was a partial massacre there. Those Texans were there for blood. And Santa Anna is captured. Now, Texas independence was never recognized by Mexico. So there are all sorts of border scrapes, raids, and incidents throughout the time Texas is independent, including some naval confrontations as well. In addition to that, they also have the ongoing problems with the Comanches and other tribes as well, which also led to a lot of debates. I say it because, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the Republic of Texas made deals with the Cherokee, which of course some of the people in there did not like because a lot of these Texans really, really hate the indigenous. Another big problem was finances. The Republic of Texas's finances are in total disarray.
Right.
And so there were some people in Texas, at least initially, who were like, "Hey, let's really make this an independent country, not join America." Within a few years, those voices are getting really weak because Texas is obviously vulnerable, and it's only probably a matter of time until Mexico invades again. And I say that because people talk about some of the origins of the war. There is definitely a pro-slavery bent to this, with the southern states seeing that they can get another slave state. There is also them being like, "Hey, the last time that war was fought, Texas almost fell, and the Mexican army committed horrendous war crimes." So there's also a fear of what will happen if a Mexican army, particularly one led by Santa Anna, returns to Texas. So anyway, those are the comments I have on the lead up to the war. Take it away, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have tons more to add. I mean, it is worth to mention that at this time, Mexico is sort of gyrating between being a democratic state and being one that is having democratic backsliding. And Santa Anna is a political figure in Mexico that tends to disregard democracy. And so the Santa Anna's second term, nearer to the Mexican-American War in the early 1840s, is actually quite dictatorial, and he's imprisoning dissidents. So
Oh, wow.
that's a sort of important, some important domestic context about what's going on. And I'm sure we can get a little bit more into the sort of roots of the Mexican-American War on the American side as well, right? Like,
Yes.
In terms of American politics. I don't want to give that short shrift because sort of what John Tyler attempts to do is very interesting. How you have a movement from not only just like pure pro-slavery sentiment, represented by Jackson, but almost like crusading, like manifest destiny ideology to expand slavery out west. And how the development of that ideology is really crucial to understanding why the Mexican-American War happens, right? Like, this is deliberate by the United States, trying by a pro-slavery president to expand, sort of nationalistically expand slavery to the West, in a way that actually makes, like, even previous pro-slavery presidents like Martin Van Buren fairly uncomfortable.
You think Van Buren was pro-slavery?
I mean, in his presidency, sure, absolutely.
Okay.
He
All right.
eventually turns and becomes anti-slavery, and it's the Mexican-American War that kind of starts that, right?
So, wait, so remember the during this argument between Formisano and Summers about this?
I don't actually.
It wasn't an intense argument, but they disagreed about Martin Van Buren. Summers said that he thought Martin Van Buren was always essentially anti-slavery. He did things for political expediency, and eventually decided he would not do that anymore. And Formisano said everything Martin Van Buren did was revenge. Like, his anti-slavery stance was not right. It was not actually what he felt. It was actually to get revenge on his old political enemies.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's kind of hard to determine that, and it's hard to determine that because his move towards an anti-slavery stance, comes out of this period, comes out of in response to the James K. Polk belief in manifest destiny and the expansion of slavery in a very radical way, that previous pro-slavery politicians would have not been super happy with. Though it's worth to note, I mean, as Derek, I'm sure you'll talk about this, has Amy Greenberg talks about how Jackson did eventually support Texas annexation later on in his life. So
I remember reading that he was initially opposed. They're couching it more in manifest destiny. There is tacitly the pro-slavery part where you're going to be adding a slave state, and also there's this, like, what the hell happens if the Mexicans retake the place? Look what happened last time. The Goliad massacre truly is a really, really horrific incident. And that also, keep that in mind too. Incidents like Goliad also make it to where Americans are understandably immediately skeptical that they could even negotiate with Mexico to begin with. And I mention that too because remember, there's also these border disputes with the British at the same time.
Yeah, right. In the Northwest.
In the Northwest, there have been, of course, disputes with the British over in the border with Maine. That actually was settled by John Tyler, by Daniel Webster and Tyler, and so there is how should I say the other thing that too is that there is, how should I say, there's American Anglophobia of the time as well. Like, I just found out a fun thing, guys. I found out that the American press during the Crimean War was pro-Russian mostly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Huh, I didn't know that.
Because I mean, they're fighting the dirty British, and they're like, the British have dared invaded another sovereign country. Who will stop perfidious Albion? And ultimately Polk is going to go with Mexico, but it should be kept in mind too that the British are much more willing and able to negotiate. That's partially because the British understand that in another serious war they could lose Canada. There was a lot of tension in Britain in 1837 when you had rebellion in Upper Canada and protests, and the American newspapers were very much supporting the rebellions and the protests that were going on in Canada in 1837. And Van Buren had to make a statement of, we're not going to invade Canada. But the British never quite trusted statements like that. So that's another thing I would say too with this is that the Mexicans are itching to get Texas back. They do believe they can win this war, and most countries in Europe think they can. The British are more realistic. they're pretty sure that in another serious war, they may not be able to hold Canada next time. So the British
Yeah.
are always be willing to talk to the Americans and have a better at foreign policy in general,
And
better foreign policy in relation to America.
and the Manifest Destiny stuff carries all the way through the 19th century. I mean, in a very sort of, and I'm not just saying this in terms of ideology. I'm saying this in terms of like very specific things. So, you know, my own research on Russian America and the transfer of Alaska from Russia to the United States, ostensibly. I mean, again, none of these colonial powers actually control it, which is another part of my research. But you see how the Americans are talking about the purchase of Alaska in 1867. And you know, just to put sort of a emphasis on your argument there, Sean, like the Americans are writing to the president and to the State Department and the military at the time, saying this the purchase of Alaska is the first step to the full annexation of British Columbia. And we can't wait until we can take all of British Columbia. They're writing this in 1867, like right after the Civil War. So, like, you know, I think the British had you know, and Canadians had reason to worry. Like,
yes,
Americans were, you know, very kind of crazed about taking Canada. And so, I mean, heck, this even connects to contemporary politics today, and we don't need to kind of get into this discussion, but I do want to mention when Canadians responded so drastically to Trump's tariffs, they're doing so for a reason. They remember this history, right? And so, you know, because it comes up every now and then.
Well, there's one thing I will mention this right quick when you say that the old flag of Canada was much more British looking, you know, before the maple leaf stuff. All right, and I saw this clip of I can't remember the two politicians. So sorry, everybody, this was a while back, but so this clip of these two Canadian politicians having a debate in the 1980s, and one of the guys is saying, "You're aligning us more with America. That's bad." You know.
Oh, interesting.
And somebody was saying that you might actually have a resurgence of that whole thing because you know Canada's been you know Canada's been socially like friendlier towards America in our lifetime, and it's hard to remember. Like I didn't even know about that with British Columbia, but it makes perfect sense. And also keeping in mind that at the time we're buying Alaska, they also had the Fenian raids in Canada, and one that you know what happens to the commander Thomas Sweeney. The British government says you know hand him over, and Andrew Johnson's response is let's give him a promotion in the regular army.
Oh,
So,
of course.
I mean, so I you know, I really wonder right now. I would not this out of our purview, but I wonder at what point do American newspapers stop and American newspapers and politicians stop talking about taking Canada?
My
It's
guess is
definitely not this time.
World War One would be
World
my
War
guess.
One?
Yeah,
Well, I'm wondering if it happened before World War One at some point.
it might have.
I do know that there was more rapprochement between how should we say American and British elites and intellectuals around the 1890s and early 20th century. You know, but anyways, so yeah, okay, I'm glad you brought that up there, man. 5440 or fight. That's a good slogan.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's a good slogan right there. That'll rally the troops, you know. So yeah, this is couch and manifest destiny and all the rest. There were attempts to negotiate with Mexico. Do you know much about that?
Not especially.
Yeah, there were attempts to negotiate with Mexico, and I believe even offers of money for some of this land, but Mexico is insisting no. Now, I'm glad that Michael brought that up about New Mexico because I found that out that New Mexico and Santa Fe. Santa Fe is a kind of a land trading hub at this time. It's actually making much more money off of the Americans. So
Yes.
So Mexico's hold over New Mexico is really tenuous.
And I want to really emphasize this. Like, when we're talking about colonial disputes over British Columbia, over the Pacific, over Alaska, over California, over the Southwest, most of this land is not controlled by the people who are debating it, right? So most Texans do not control most of modern day Texas. Comanches do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, like, hell, I mean, like, I mean, what the Louisiana Purchase, you know, that's sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm not just say tell us joke much on tour, but I'm like, you know, what do they control? New Orleans and St. Louis.
Uh-huh.
I mean, isn't it It's fairly safe to say, though, that for most of those maps of the interior of North America during the colonial period, that it's more a theoretical control rather than a really hands-on control for the French, Spanish, British, etc.
What I argue is it's a map of who has the right of conquest of those areas. So yeah.
Yes, yes, 100%. So that's
Um,
what it is. It's saying that, hey, look, we know that you essentially control, well, not just New Orleans. I would say Louisiana in general at that time.
yeah.
By the time the purchase, the Red River Valley and the rest is developed enough to where, okay, you've got Louisiana and you've got these little outposts, and the biggest one's probably St. Louis.
Yeah.
But you get beyond that, you got nothing. So, but it
So
is for the right for future conquest. That's what it is.
yeah. And so at the end of the Mexican-American War, what the Americans will actually control on the ground are a good portion of California because of the gold rush and the tons of American settlers coming in, and the eastern part of Texas. That is what the Americans will actually control out there on the ground. Only after the Civil War will the rest of those interior parts of what was previously northern Mexico, ostensibly, actually be conquered by the United States over the course of the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s.
Oh, also, I would say Central Texas, like
Mhm.
Austin. But that's also a lot of Germans start selling there as well.
Yeah, that's
Interesting
true.
fact, by the way, when Texas secedes in 1861, one of their chief complaints is you have not done enough to defeat the Comanche.
Yeah. Right? That doesn't surprise me because
I mean,
that's right.
it's not an aside in the it's not an aside in the secession discussions of the document. They're straight up like, if we get away from the Americans, we can take care of this ourselves finally. Because they're the American in their opinion, the American army is bungling the war, dealing with the Comanche throughout the 1850s. But anyways, one other one to mention too is this spot. Territory though is really in an odd spot during all of this. Nobody's sure who's in control. Utah.
Oh yeah,
That's
right.
why the Mormons are there.
Oh, that's its own kind of crazy history that we probably don't have time to get into.
No,
Um,
we'll have to mention it. I do have to mention that very early in this war, the Americans will go to the Mormons and say, "Hey, we'll give you protection as long as you give us troops."
right.
And they're I don't know if the Mexican government was going to try to get to the Mormons first, but apparently there were debates among the Mormons when this war starts about who should we support, and the Americans come very quickly and say, "Hey, we just want you to give us some troops." So there actually is a Mormon battalion that will take part in the war.
And apparently, the Polks are personally quite helpful to the Mormons. I was reading in the Taylor book that the Polks actually donate $10 to the Mormons themselves, in which a lot of sort of Whigs at the time really oppose, right? Because it's
Yeah,
it's it's the Whigs who see the Mormons as like polygamous, evil, evil people essentially. And so
that's not
it's
surprising to me, man. And
yeah.
I find the Whigs in general are the least religiously tolerant of the two parties.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
well, I
yeah,
guess the Democrats had to have some built-in tolerance at this time because it's like a coalition of slave owners and small landowners.
and
Well, also
Democrats.
the one thing, well, we talk about the policies that political parties have changing over time, and people ask me like, well, is the Democrats have any constant? I'm like, the Democratic Party has been a pro-immigration party from the moment of Andrew Jackson to today. It always has been.
Pretty
Interesting.
much with the exception of like KKK Indiana. Yeah.
Yeah, and even then, that's KKK Indiana, so those guys are also like also Republicans. A lot of them.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. Gosh,
Oh,
Indiana's
But I
so
mean, you're
weird.
talking like 1920s Ku Klux Klan. That's a whole different beast.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. So, but anyway, so no, not. Anyways, I'm not surprised about that. They do win the Mormons over very quickly. But yeah, Utah is this area that nobody really knows who's supposed to be in charge here, and by doing this, the Americans are laying their claim to Utah at that moment. The other one too is, what is the overall situation in California?
Yeah.
Uh, from what I've read in California, you have a lot of people. You have a lot of the native population is a lot made up of, once again, of a lot of people who do not like the policies of Mexico City and themselves were looking to declare independence.
Yeah, and you look at it as well in terms of how many settlers are there, both American settlers and also sort of Mexican settlers, right? And who controls what? And the sort of answers is you have these missionary towns on on the coast, and the interior again is controlled mostly by indigenous peoples and will
Yeah.
remain controlled by indigenous peoples until the gold rush, until you get arguably the first sort of mass sort of genocide. There's an argument that after the Mexican American War, American settlers really do commit a genocide against indigenous Californians in the 1850s. um,
From my limited reading on it, I concur. One of the Union generals, by the way, during the Civil War, Nathaniel Lyon, he battles a tribe in California. I forget their name, and he straight up commits a full blown genocide. I'm not just talking about, oh, you beat him in a battle. No, no, he's butchering hundreds of people
and
indiscriminately.
this is the
But
state of California.
Nathaniel Lyon is a psychopath. All right,
Yeah,
I read his biography. That guy's insane. All right.
but the territory of California and the state of California is literally putting out bounties for murdering indigenous Californians. Like you're
Yeah.
paying people to do it. It is pretty particularly brutal. Definitely read up on
Matches
that.
the brutality of this one matches another Indian war, because we were mentioning earlier about we were mentioning earlier about the French in Louisiana losing to the Chickasaw.
Oh yeah,
Before that, they had obliterated the Natchez tribe. And
yeah,
then that the Natchez War is one of the most explicitly genocidal wars I've ever read about. The French even burned some Natchez alive in what is today Jackson Square.
yeah. It's pretty
That's because
horrific.
the Natchez attacked Fort Rosalie. There was this massive massacre there. I think they killed like 300 people. And then the French, they just go, no, we're going to kill all of them. And part of the reason they fought the Chickasaw was because the last remnants of the Natchez got shelter at the Chickasaw. So
Yep.
that's one of their stated reasons is we have to kill all these Natchez. So yeah, no, the stuff in California that's going on, I'd heard about the bounties. In the case of Nathaniel Lyon, at least, he commits an explicitly genocidal campaign against a
Yeah.
tribe that I think killed maybe 3 people or something. Like,
Yeah.
but
No, it's nuts. It's like
yeah, yeah,
two American settlers killed, four villages of hundreds of people burned down and destroyed and
yeah.
murdered. Like that's kind of how it goes. And that's sort of some important context connecting the Mexican American War, because it's pretty interesting. Some people in U.S. Army regiments and forces that invade Mexico start equating Mexicans with Native Americans. And there's an aspect that this war becomes a little bit of a race war. And it doesn't help that, uh, as you're saying, Sean, that the Mexican army already had a uh, previous instances of mass murdering of American prisoners and Texan prisoners as well, right? So this becomes a pretty brutal war, where you do not want to be a prisoner or civilian caught in one of the in this conflict.
Oh yeah, there's one guy. What was his name? Amputita. Guys, I'm terrible at I'm terrible at Spanish. Okay, he was a commander at Monterrey. He was also a subordinate at Palo Alto and Buena Vista. He was notorious for torturing prisoners and, in some cases, decapitating them and frying their heads.
That's pretty horrific.
Yeah, yeah.
Damn.
By the way, his Wikipedia article is horrible. They make him out like he was a competent commander. He was not. He's one of the worst generals, if not the worst general of this war.
What's his name again?
Um, let me pull up his full name here, okay? Because I've got him around here. Because he was there. He is, Pedro Ampudia. It's like Ampudia.
Okay.
Yeah, he was the commander at Monterrey. Um, definitely not a good general, and definitely a terrible, terrible person. But
Oh, here
anyways,
it is.
so we get what else do we have for the origins of the war? Uh,
I
so
mean, so I think we gave a good context of the area in the West, and I appreciate you guys letting me to go into tangents about Indigenous history. Important.
yeah, well,
Um,
you're absolutely correct, of course. Yeah,
but I do think we need to get into sort of the American context, right? And the key
right.
players here. And William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, the politics of Texas annexation, Henry Clay, that sort of stuff. So I don't know who wants to. I've been talking a lot, so I'm taking a brief step back.
No, the specific politics for leading into the Mexican American War is not something I can speak about in good detail. My stuff's really my stuff after this is really going to kick off for when the shooting starts.
Got
All
it.
right.
Well,
So
I'm happy to talk about it, but yeah, Thersites, go ahead.
So I know a little bit about the political lead up. So obviously we've been talking about the settlers have a manifest destiny mindset. So there's been talk about going west. Well, the big breaking point is when you have the election of 1844. So obviously Clay was considered to be the front runner for most of it, but he ends up losing to a relative nobody named James K. Polk, who effectively got where he was in politics by kissing Andrew Jackson's ass. That's really where he comes from.
Yeah.
And so he's taken power now, and he will be the primary mover of the war. He does so, by the way, with quite a bit of reservation from many of his own cabinet members, including Secretary of State James Buchanan. And so Polk, one of the reasons why he got the nomination in the first place was that he effectively did a one-term pledge, so that way all the more ambitious members of the Democratic Party would let him have the nomination. And he is not in the strongest position, so we think of him as this warmongering president who, ruthlessly pushed to the West Coast. At the same time, though, he was kind of fighting from the bottom in Washington, at least, because he will not have a lot of support from most of the senior leaders in the army, most of whom are Whigs. And so Polk is an interesting figure in that he was not widely respected, liked, or taken seriously, and yet he would launch, arguably up to this point, and maybe even beyond it, the most important war of aggression that America has ever done. So it's an interesting political dynamic that he's got going, but a lot of it's him taking advantage of this westward expansion desire, and it builds up a lot of support for the war. A lot of people who normally probably wouldn't be into such a thing got some patriotic fervor, including Henry Clay's own son. So Henry Clay, of course, was not into anything Polk wanted to do just on principle, but also he thought it was a bad idea, as did a number of people privately, but because the public fervor blew up for going to war against Mexico, a lot of people signed up and got really into it because they wanted to go be heroes. And what's also interesting, but kind of embarrassing, I guess, to read about now, is a whole lot of the veterans of this war, when asked why they volunteered, they effectively said they wanted to go to Mexico, kill some Mexicans, and maybe bang some senoritas.
Yeah.
What the fuck?
I mean, these guys,
No,
a lot of them
seriously.
talk about it. A lot of them talk about their desire to, I really want to kill a Mexican before I go home. So there are a lot of people who
Oh
complain,
yeah.
writing to their families, like, I haven't gotten to kill anybody yet. This sucks.
Oh well, I mean, you got to get glory too, right? And
Yeah,
think about how many men are in this war who are politicians, right? Like Gideon J. Pillow is one of them.
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh
You get
God.
some, I mean, and I mean that's a feature of American warfare throughout the 1800s.
Well, that
And
is, it's also, there's an interesting dynamic, too, between pros and amateurs in the U.S. Army. Because
Hmm.
there's mutual animosity, and both effectively think the other is incompetent and untrustworthy.
Yeah, and also
Because,
keeping in mind too, we say pros. I mean, guys like Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott didn't go to West Point, but they had fought in the War of 1812, and
right,
Scott himself was an excellent general. Uh, so yeah, the guys who call themselves pros are just are not so much like trained that way, but they were trained in the, I don't know, school of hard knocks, you might say, because War of
right.
1812 was the American Army did very poorly in that war.
right.
We started getting better towards the very end, and that took a lot of defeats to get there.
Well, I mean, at this
Scott, of
point, I
course.
guess like West
Exactly.
Point was still an unproven concept because they'd had it around, but
Yeah.
they didn't know if it actually helped. Um, and the other thing
Well,
is
see,
a
it's
lot of
more
the
of an engineering school at
yeah,
this
and
point, really.
so the pros think the amateurs will be ruthless and undisciplined, which they turn out to be because American troops commit a lot of atrocities. On the other hand, the amateurs, effectively to use modern language, think that professional soldiers are beta males because they follow orders. And a real true American who's a free person can't be a soldier because soldiering is girly, at least on a permanent basis.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
the 19th century is a weird place, guys.
Well, yeah, it's very
Speaking
different
of
um,
than
like,
today.
yeah,
well, I
but
mean, the American Army it's a small army. It does have some pretty strict discipline overall. I mean, we mentioned Don Carlos Buell. I mean, he beat a soldier up, right? And at the same time, too, a lot of the men who have joined the army are a lot of them are immigrants, especially Irish immigrants. There's a lot of Irish in this army.
Yep,
You know,
and the
guys
Mexicans will
fresh off
take
the boat.
advantage.
Yes, they will. Yes, they will. San Patrico Battalion. But yeah, so no, you have a lot of people who are in the army are not coming are coming from the a lot of people Americans would view as the fringes and dregs of society.
so this is sort of a good transition point into the military part of the war. I just wanted to add one quick thing about leading to the run up of this war. So William Henry Harrison is elected president as a Whig, famously dies very quickly after his inauguration, and his vice president, John Tyler, takes over in the early 1840s. The thing about John Tyler is he's a Whig who effectively immediately betrays his own party and acts like a Democrat. And so
I
this is the
disagree.
context going into the 1844 election um, between Clay and Polk. And Tyler secretly tries to annex Texas and pisses off
Cool.
a lot of people in Washington by doing so. Um, and so it's worth to note that like this sort of like for patriotic fervor for going into war with Mexico like was not there in the early 1840s. It is a project that is put together by James K. Polk, who takes very specific actions to try to create an incident between the Mexican and American armies in disputed territory between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande.
Right. I will say just real quick, I disagree about Tyler. I don't think he betrayed the Whigs. Tyler just didn't like Andrew Jackson, and the Whigs were they just understand who the guy was. It's their fault for making him VP.
Hmm,
you
fair
know,
enough. There's
that,
a,
that
I
Tyler
will
was
say,
his own man. But no, I think the moment look the moment Texas is annexed, war is going to happen. The Mexican government is unstable at this time.
yeah.
And in their opinion, Texas is Mexican territory. So they believe the Americans have already seized their sovereign territory. And they're going to want to fight over this strip of land. Now, the strip of land itself there between the Nueces and the Rio Grande, sparsely populated, not really that economically developed. However, controlling the Rio Grande and what is especially the mouth of the river, what is today Brownsville, Texas,
Mhm.
is important for the economy of northern Mexico. So if the Americans control the other side of the river, they're going to have a lot of influence over trade and economics in that area. And one of the things that bugs the Mexicans, probably had to bug the Mexicans right away, is that when the American army comes, the Mexican merchants who are already in that area happily trade with the Americans because the American dollar is worth good money.
Yep.
Yep. So immediately the people in the region are who I mean keep in mind too, this region was settled by people who don't like the government of Mexico City to begin with. These Americans arrive with fat pockets and lots of money, so they immediately start dealing with them right away. They're not when Zachary Taylor lands with his army in Corpus Christi, he is not greeted sullenly. He's not cheered per se, but he's not greeted sullenly. They're more like, okay, well, you're here now. Oh, wow, you brought a lot of money? Cool. Why'd you stick around, you know? So that has to also make the Mexicans very, very nervous. Um, I don't know. In some ways, this there's this idea that Americans don't fire the first shot, but we try to maneuver the other guy into doing it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we also have to chalk this up to the Mexican government is inept in their foreign policy, and they do genuinely believe that if they get into a fight with the Americans, they will win.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
But
I
it's
I have trouble viewing this as a war of American aggression. I view this more as a war that both sides won in the end.
seriously okay. I
As a, as a
100% think
as a
this is
war
a
that
war of American aggression.
you said as a war that both sides wanted, or a war that both sides won.
No, both sides want the war, I think.
Oh, okay.
I mean, no, the Mexican policy during this is bellicose. They send an army into the disputed area. They say to the army, if you encounter Americans, shoot them. You know, they don't back down. Any attempts at negotiation fail. We can say that the negotiation attempts on the American part, we could argue about how serious they are, how perfidious they are, but the Mexican government doesn't spin this war being like, oh my God, we can't believe you're doing this to us. They're like, yeah, we'll beat you. They are
I
intent
mean,
that they're going to win this war.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm not arguing that the Mexican government wasn't bellicose. I agree with you on that. However, what is an American army doing in independent Texas at this time, right? I mean, until Texas is annexed, right?
Texas has been annexed by America. The
Yeah,
Mexican position, which is totally understandable, is this was Mexican territory. We
yeah.
have now occupied Mexican territory. So their position in that regard is legit. However, realistically, how were they going to hold on to it? Their plan for holding on to it before failed miserably. They tried to put down the rebellion against them and were defeated, and embarrassingly so, in the last battle of the war. In fact, if the Mexicans really looked at the way their army performed during the War of Texas Independence, it did not perform well. But they overestimated themselves, and they said, hey, look, we won every battle until the very last one. But I'm like, yeah, but Coleto Creek was a tough battle. The Americans essentially lost that because they ran out of ammo. And the Alamo, your casualties were horrific. You know, I also think that the Mexicans are not being, and also here's the biggest problem too. Here's the other one too. This is why I'm saying the Mexicans are not being realistic. Mexico doesn't really make its own gunpowder. They rely on imports from Europe. And, you know, when you said you're going to start with a joke, when you said about, you know, this war starts when the horses come in with the Spanish. Well, my joke is this war is won by the U.S. Navy because they blockade the ports and seize numerous ports. And so the Mexicans cannot get gunpowder in for their army. And the Mexican army itself, as racist as a lot of these U.S. soldiers are, a lot of them comment on the bravery of the Mexican soldiers, but how poorly served they are by their officers.
Yeah.
And keeping in mind, too, the Mexican officers, like a lot of the American ones, are also here to seek glory for political advantage. We're going to have numerous former presidents of Mexico commanding armies. Now, the Americans have their share of bickering and problems, especially because Polk doesn't want a Whig to get too much glory and become president. But it has got nothing on what's going to happen with the Mexicans. Mexicans, what I found, the cavalry really didn't have any arms. Like they weren't very poor. They didn't really have a lot of guns. They didn't fight as dragoons. A lot of them were lancers. Lancers actually can be pretty useful, but only in more specific situations. There's a lot of morale problems, training problems, but I'd say one of the real crucial ones is a lack of gunpowder means that these men do not have much practice with their weapons. So especially later in the war, especially like a battle like Buena Vista, where Santa Anna cobbled together an army and raised a large army, but the army, despite its massive size, was poorly trained. And by that time, the gunpowder shortage is acute. And then last but not least is the artillery. Mexican artillery for this era might be the worst of any major combatant of the entire horse and musket era.
Yeah, weren't they like taking? Weren't they like taking
is,
guns out of like old forts from the 1600s and putting wheels on them and shit? I mean,
oh yeah, no, the guns. A lot of these guns are antiquated. They are heavy. They don't have good officers in charge of them. Another big, I mean, there were cannons that we captured in this war that we're looking at that said "Last Argument of Kings." It's like the foundry would be like someplace in France from like 1680. So Mexican artillery also is very, very poor in this war. And then, of course, once again, the gunpowder shortage. So Mexico, I really do question the level of bellicoseness they have, but I think also, Michael, this plays a part in which you mentioned earlier about not fortifying the coasts because of
Yeah.
what? Yellow fever, right?
Yeah, I mean that was sort of the idea. So yeah, so there's a tactic that the Spanish Empire used during the colonial period, and that the Mexican government followed afterwards. That the way you're going to stop invaders is when they land on the tropical coast, the invaders are going to catch yellow fever and die. Uh, and so you don't need fortifications on the coast. You need fortifications in the mountains.
Mm.
And so this was a tactic that the Spanish Empire used actually to some decent success against the British, and also against companies that attempted to try to settle parts of Central America. Like, for instance, most famously, there was a group of Scottish settlers who tried to settle Panama in the 1680s, completely wiped out by disease. And
that one talking about the British, that's Cartagena, which is
yeah,
today
the British is
Venezuela.
Cartagena.
Was it Colombia? Cartagena's in Colombia, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. They land like 12,000 soldiers. I want to say 9 to 10,000 just died of yellow fever and other tropical diseases.
Yeah.
Also,
So
another part of the strategy too is guerrillas
mhm.
and just partisans to attack them with their supply lines. So even if you're landing in a port and your army is marching into the interior, the Mexicans also want to rely on those forces to attack your supply wagons. You know,
Right.
so there are those reasons there, but anyways, so we have these two armies here, and then we have the Thornton affair, right? What's the line on this one? Here, I gotta find this. And so when that happens, this is what Polk's are going to use as a rallying cry. And I'm trying to find what his exact line is. It's something like blood has been spilled on American soil.
Yes, American blood has been spilt on American soil. And now that is
Yeah.
a controversial claim because this is the strip of land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. So
Oh,
this is Polk going to the American public and saying the United States was attacked by an offensive action by Mexico, right? Um, and so, eventually we'll talk about the sort of the opposition to the war later. Abraham Lincoln will come in as a first-time congressman and get the nickname Spotty Abe Lincoln because he is so obsessed with where was the actual spot where Americans were killed in the initial outbreak of conflict between the United States and Mexico, and trying to use that argument to basically say this is not a legally justifiable war.
This, by the way, this doesn't work. From what I'm reading at this moment, most Americans rally to Polk. I think he gets almost all the House of Representatives to vote for him, doesn't he?
Initially, yes. So this happens later, after the war starts going a little bit more poorly for Americans, and as casualties
Okay.
start mounting.
Gotcha.
So this is late 1847, I believe, maybe even 1848.
That's when Lincoln gave the spot speech.
Yeah.
Because I know, like as a member of the House, Lincoln essentially didn't really do much, but he's mostly known for this.
Yeah.
Stunt here,
And,
but anyways.
And it's a big deal because at the time his district is very heavily pro Polk and pro Mexican American War. He loses a lot of political cred for making this his main political push in the House of Representatives.
It's interesting. I think he probably learned quite a bit from that, considering some of the actions he does in the Civil War, where he's, how should we say, a little more circumspect. That being said, he's also, of course, he was like, Henry Clay was his political, Henry Clay was his, essentially like his political role model. more than
Yeah.
anybody else. And Clay is opposed to the war. Derek, you read about the opposition of the war, right?
Yeah, a little bit in the same book that Michael read, the Greenberg book.
Yeah.
Yeah. So by regions, the South is going to heavily support this war.
Yes,
Uh,
as
this is where
will
we
the
get
Midwest.
this is where the University of Tennessee gets their name, right? Oh yeah, Midwest. Yes, I got some stuff on I got not much on this, but one thing about the Midwest, two states in particular that have a lot of support for this war: Indiana and Michigan.
And a fair amount from Illinois.
Mhm.
Yes, yes, Illinois as well. But yeah, the Indiana and Michigan were two of the standouts in that regard. Tennessee, of course, is a big one. The thing is that the recruitment stuff is not very well handled at first. So, for instance, there's a guy named Edmund Gaines who was in New Orleans, and he was there to raise Louisiana troops, and he bungled it. So there were thousands of Louisiana troops who were raised for the war and then just went home. I do have some numbers for you on this, though. At
Yeah.
the start of the war, the army, get this is how big the American army was: 6,562 officers and men.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Regiments of infantry.
barely a
What'd you
colonel
say?
to build around. It's barely a colonel to even build around.
With, I believe, 8 regiments of infantry. I don't have the numbers on artillery and cavalry in front of me. However, here's how it would balloon to 116,000.
Yeah.
And of those, there will be 36,000 regulars. The army will increase by 30,000 regulars, and there will be 73,000 volunteers. Most of these men will not see combat. All right. And that's because a lot of the way they rose the volunteer armies, and this will play a part in the Civil War, because the Union and Confederacy, they'll do some stumbling at first with raising volunteer forces, but overall they do a good job. And they were looking to what happened in the Mexican War, because there's some units raised in the Mexican War that have a 3-month enlistment, which means they're essentially useless.
Yeah.
Right, because of the time it takes to get to the theater.
Right. And 6-month enlistments as well, those are not very useful either. They're barely better. Now there were shorter term enlistments used during the Civil War. There were some 3-month Ohio units used during the summer of 1864, but the point of them was to free up other units for garrison duty. There were 9-month emergency regiments raised in the fall of 1862. That had to do with the Union bungling so badly in the summer of 1862. But overall, those measures made a lot more sense than this one. It is a mess in raising troops. However, that being said, one thing they mention right now is America's logistics for this war are a light years ahead of what they were for their previous big wars. And that is another reason for the confidence that Mexico had going in, for the confidence the confidence not only of Mexico, but the Europeans thinking Mexico is going to win. Famously, the Duke of Wellington was very much like, hey, Mexico's probably going to win this thing. And by the way, one of the reasons he mentioned that, Michael, is because of that stuff with swamp with diseases. Wellington was very much like, hey, matter of fact, Wellington was the one who said, don't go to New Orleans, because he said going through the swamps will be difficult and everything's bad for your health, But what happens is that the American army, think about it, we had not really done well in those other 2 wars. We started winning battles only towards the end of the War of 1812. The American Revolution, for every battle we won, we lost a battle. And a lot of Europeans, understandably so, looked at the American Revolution and said, you won because of France.
Yeah.
So
No, for sure.
the American military at this time is held in low regard in Europe as well. Whereas the Mexican military, to these outside observers, was a military that had a lot of experience, that had been involved in a lot of fights. Now, some of these are putting down rebellions, quite violent, viciously too. In
But I
fact,
guess too, do you think part of
there are a
the
number of rebellions going on during the war.
do you think part of the perception of the Mexican army was that because Santa Anna is a little bit of a Napoleon cosplayer, the idea is like they will be able to fight big battles more competently than the U.S., which only really fights in the woods behind trees?
Something like that, or that the Americans are poor regulars. Now, anybody really examining the War of 1812 and the American Revolution closely would have seen that the American military improved during those wars. And you had the what happens the Battle of Chippewa in the War of 1812. the Americans come up and the British are like, "Hey, we got them. You know, we've been kicking their ass the whole time." And apparently, the British commander, I forget his name off the top of my head, I think it might have been Ryle. He said he sees the Americans, he sees them form up under fire, and he goes, because he says something like, "Oh my God, those are regulars." So anybody been paying attention would have seen like, hey, Americans can do more than just beat up on the Creek. All right, but there are problems with this, and you do see that early on with the war with recruitment problems and some of the amateurishness. That being said, the Americans did a lot better with logistics in this war, showed a substantial improvement over the previous wars. So the American army during this one is going to be generally well armed, fed, and taken care of. Although one way, by the way, I did find this out. One way the American army got around spending too much money was if you joined the volunteer unit, you had to bring your own clothes.
Nice.
Yeah, now they eventually did give stipends out and a few other things, but yeah, they're like, hey, bring as much of your own stuff as possible.
Also, apparently they paid stipends to officers, and I think every officer was entitled to one servant. And, the higher ranking you are, the more you can have.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know about that.
Yeah, and I guess,
So
so if you're a colonel, you can have two, and then the big generals, Taylor and Scott, had four.
I'm going to run real quick to because we're going to get into this, and I'm going to refill my water and grab a banana, and then I can start with Taylor's first few battles and how that's going to go, and touch a little bit on probably New Mexico and California.
Yeah, that
Okay.
sounds great.
All right, and
All right.
when you come back, Sean, I need to ask you a super important question. So be ready for the most important question you've ever answered in your life.
I'm hearing light sarcasm here. I'm hearing light sarcasm, man. All right.
All right, I'm gonna pull up a picture of General Wool real fast because he was a pretty big deal here.
Got it.
Let's see.
Should we fill in any details while Sean is gone?
Yeah, we could. So, of all the people who fought in the Mexican War, does anybody stand out to you, Michael? All the participants?
I'm sure Sean's going to talk about this, but the number of Civil War generals who fight in this war is pretty substantial, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I guess too, I guess I don't know how many other people read it, but Jeff Shera wrote historical novels, and one of them about Mexico focused heavily on, Grant, Beauregard, Lee, and a lot of the other guys who would
Right.
become internationally famous within 15 years.
Right.
But yeah,
So it's pretty important.
well, that, and I do think there's a case to be made that a lot of the guys who died in the war, it had things played out differently. Had they survived, they would have actually been power brokers in America going into the
Yeah.
Civil War. I mean, like,
So
famously in the book we read, there's, John J. Hardin, who was
yeah.
the Crown Prince of Illinois for all practical intents and purposes.
And that's sort of big what if of the war. If he survives, does Abraham Lincoln become a prominent politician? Probably not.
Well, there's
Because
also, Henry Clay Jr.
yeah, right. So Whig politics, which will eventually turn into Republican politics and anti-slavery politics, might have looked quite different if Henry Clay Jr. and Hardin survived this war. You very well could have had a very different political class. And I'm not sure if that necessarily changes the sort of political history of the U.S., but it does change the actors who control it, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, one of these guys might have even been president during the war.
yeah, because Hardin. So Lincoln comes from Hardin's district, and Hardin is a very prominent politician in that district. Basically, Hardin's death gives an opportunity for Lincoln to enter Congress.
For sure.
Um,
Although I guess, Lincoln will be in the political wilderness for a while because of what you were talking about earlier, how he opposed the war.
but that will eventually. He earns a lot of political credit among the Whig politicians who are going to become Republicans
Right.
from his actions.
Also, it has to be said, but when you look at the picture of John J. Hardin, I mean, he's got a very 1970s haircut.
Really? Let
I
me
mean, it
let me
looks
pull this
like it. I
up.
mean, check it out. Like his official Wikipedia portrait. There's some 1970s. Like he could walk into a party in the 1970s and it look like he's dressed from the last century, but he's got a modern haircut. Like
All
that'd be a
right, I
great
gotta.
Halloween costume.
He does. Wow. Yeah, he would fit. He would fit into a 70s disco, no problem.
Or hell, I mean, like even this is kind of like a bigger version of the hairdo that Shatner had in like Wrath of Khan. Even,
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. Yeah, that's a good point.
and I guess of all the politicians, he's one of the few guys who actually looks like he would stand out even now, though. Like he would be able to promote himself and market himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Also, actually, before getting into the military stuff, one thing that I found very interesting reading about Polk's presidency is that his wife Sarah Polk was pretty involved in his administration, and they had a lot of the same ideological goals. Um, they both believed in sort of American manifest destiny. Um, and they saw the Mexican American War as sort of a project to for the United States to fulfill that destiny, to stretch all the way to the Pacific.
Yeah, and I guess she
And
also was like the one who made sure that he took a bath and everything.
yeah, because I mean, we people can have disagreements about James K. Polk in terms of his policies. He was probably one of the most hardworking American presidents in American history. I mean,
Well, yeah,
this guy was
also a major
dedicated.
micromanager.
Yeah, he was like chained to his desk for the entire um, portion of the war,
Yeah,
which was
it's
not common at this time.
well, also apparently it damaged his health, and everybody around him said, "Dude, you need to slow down or take a break." Because if you think about it, it sounds like he's really devoted to duty if he's chained to his desk. But if you think about the pace of communications, he's always 2 to 3 weeks behind whatever's happening in Mexico.
Right?
So him sitting at his desk and worrying all day does not actually accomplish anything. So I think
And
that's something that needs to be pointed out is that even though yeah he's very hardworking, he's not working productively. He's just working because of nerves.
those communication gaps are really going to cause some problems when his designated appointee Nicholas Trist goes down to negotiate a treaty with Mexico, and pretty much kind of does his own thing and doesn't follow Polk's orders.
Well, to be fair, I
This
mean Polk knew that anybody he chose was going to stab him in the back. So
Yeah, that's true. So, I mean, this really is a time where presidents don't have the degree of authority and power that they do today, right?
right, not to mention
So,
with the lack of instant communication or even close to instant communication. I mean, without that, it's very hard to really control that process. I mean, you pretty much have to delegate and hope for the best.
yeah. So we'll get into that later about the treaty negotiations and how this war ends because it's a very interesting story in and of
Oh,
itself.
for sure, yeah, and I think too, because remember we talked about Buchanan and his micromanagement. I wonder how much that he picked up while working for Polk because they kind of had the same leadership style, except Buchanan was a little bit more relaxed. But
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, in some ways they do. I think Buchanan was less competent, frankly. Um, but
probably,
they're both ideologically sort of committed. That's for sure.
yeah. It's also interesting to me that given how the pro-slavery part of the country was all for the war because they thought it would be more slave territory. It's interesting that among the people who did oppose the war was Buchanan.
Yeah, at least
Like,
initially.
yeah, and then I guess he warmed up to it, especially once Trist comes on the scene and he's about to go out. Buchanan's trying to cozy up to him, like, "Hey, when you go out to make that deal, I got some ideas what you should do. Don't tell the president
Yeah,
I
no,
said this."
and that's the wild thing. Like at the end of the war, Buchanan opposes that treaty and basically says we should annex all of Mexico. Which is a bit of about face from kind of what he was initially arguing for.
Yeah, that's another weird dynamic is that apparently, even as overall support for the war waned among the people who still supported it, they started to really broaden the horizons of what we should take.
I mean, it's a little bit of a situation of kind of getting drunk on power. And the sort of news that Scott takes Mexico City really turns all these already fairly pro-slavery, mostly Southerners, into even sort of more rapidly being like, we could take the whole damn thing. Or
That
we can get no, go ahead.
Yeah, and another facet of the war that interests me is how I guess some of the anti-war sentiment that will emerge, or at least anti-imperialist sentiment, will be just pure racism. Like the
Yeah,
idea of like how many
absolutely.
Mexicans do we want in this country? So maybe we shouldn't take this stuff. Maybe we should just leave it because otherwise, how are we gonna civilize these people?
And by the
Well,
way, this is going.
it's funny you mentioned that. By the way, that was one of the things said in opposition to the Louisiana Purchase.
Mhm.
Was, can we really have a bunch of like Frenchified Creoles running around? I mean, they're all into like absolutism.
Right.
And
I mean, yeah, because we're thinking about like the differences in morality between then and now. So I mean, we have racism used to oppose imperialism. The military is for sissies. So I mean, there's been a lot of changes in our society since the Mexican War. It's kind of nuts.
and the same imperialist, anti-imperialist debates will have the exact same sort of racial politics in the 1890s and 1900s, where you have actually more people who are progressive on issues of race actually support imperialist um, things like annexing the Philippines, annexing Hawaii. And it's, in fact, more of the racists who actually oppose it. So, yeah, different time. 1800s was a different time, y'all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you mentioned that one with the Philippines. I mean, there's that thing is in Puck, that cartoon of like Uncle Sam trying to teach a bunch of Filipino kids, how to be Americans. Um, yeah, no, there was yeah, there's a whole thing about Louisiana Purchase where it's like, and which is also but Louisiana Purchase where it's like, you can't have the French in here because they're just not Americans. They don't have any idea of Republican traditions. Which, by the way, is a big reason why America's policy when they take over Louisiana is we got to get rid of the French culture here. Which they start with that with the law. All laws in English, all court proceedings in English.
Right.
Uh,
Hmm.
anyways, so do you want to go into the military, or do we have any? Oh, yeah, I think you had a question for me or something,
Oh
right?
yes,
Oh, right.
Sean.
Question.
So
Yeah.
you spoke of Colonel Fannin earlier, and it turns out there is a Colonel Fannin's whiskey. What I want to know is it good?
Oh my God, I've never even heard of it, man. I didn't know if they made a whiskey for him because he was one of those. I mean, he got a few things named after him in Texas, but you know, he was pitied, but he's often seen as incompetent. That he could have helped out the guys in the Alamo more, which is highly doubtful. Um, he wasn't a particularly good leader. I think it's funny they named a whiskey after him.
Yeah, it's definitely after him. I mean, if you look at the bottle, it's got a cannon on it and everything, a cannon from that era, so it's got to be a reference to him. Apparently, they sell it at
So,
Total Wine and More, which I used to live near one of these, but I guess I don't now, so never mind.
no, you know what? I'll write that down. We got a Total Wine in Metairie. I'll drop in and see if they got Colonel Fannon's whiskey. Sure, why not, man? All right, let me write that down. Colonel Fannin whiskey.
I mean, does it taste
Sure,
like
why
coming up short?
not? Tastes like incompetence. So let's see. Um, so the the opening battles, because the Thornton thing is just it's a skirmish, right? But there you go, American blood, American soil, and we will very soon after get our first battle. Now, little notes on the commanders. The one in charge is Jose Mariano Arista. Any of you know anything about this guy?
I do not. I was leaving the military stuff to you, to be honest.
Gotcha. God, I didn't know if anybody had any comments on these generals. Okay, so Arista is like a lot of these generals in this war. He is a major political figure. In fact, he had previously, not previously, but eventually he was um, one of the presidents of Mexico. He got deposed. He got deposed by Santa Anna, who then exiled him. So him and Santa Anna do not get along. But keep in mind, Santa Anna's not here at the time. All right. So Santa's not in charge of Mexico. So, anyways, uh, this man he had been spending a lot of time building up the army in the disputed zone, ready to fight. He will confront Taylor in 2 battles. First one is Palo Alto. This is the only battlefield from this war that is preserved and you can visit it in America. It's right near the border. I've never been, but the images of it look kind of interesting to me. This as far as all the battles go in this war. A lot of these battles are quite ferocious with some heavy losses in many cases. This is not one of them. The casualties are relatively light during this one. All right. That said, you already see superiority of American artillery. Arista actually had more cannons than the Americans, 12 to 8, but American artillery was very effective at preventing him from turning their left flank. So Arista pulls back. By the way, his second in command is Pedro Ampudia. These two do not like each other. Ampudia is the one who notoriously used to fry people's decapitated heads. Well, the next battle will happen. I want to say it happens the very next day, too. Yes, it does. The very next day, May 9th, 1846, is the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, which is the image we used for the thumbnail for this. This is a pretty bad battle for the Mexicans. Once again, American artillery is going to dominate the battlefield. The Mexican army started to collapse. Arista actually wasn't at the battle at first. He comes in, leads a counterattack that fails, and then he blamed Ampudia for the defeat in general. This battle was pretty bad because the losses for it are roughly something like 500 for the Mexicans and only a little over 100 for us. And keep this in mind, too, the Mexican army significantly outnumbered us. Should also be, and they outnumbered in Palo Alto as well, but especially at this one. Now, this is also worth noting, too, is the American commander of this one is going to be the key figure for the opening battles. That is Zachary Taylor. Do you guys have any notes on Zachary Taylor? Or should I just go on this one?
Well, I don't know that much about Zach Taylor, really.
Gotcha.
Becomes a prominent Whig, but yeah, go ahead.
He's not a Whig at this point, though. One of the reasons he was tapped by Polk is because Taylor was seen as apolitical. He didn't say anything political. I think there's even people say he barely even voted or anything. So Polk is thinking, if this guy wins some battles, then I'm going to be A-okay. I'll be fine. Now the thing with Taylor is, I say somewhat of a controversial commander. There have been a number of people I've found in the last few years who have rated him not that well. So, for instance, there's a board game on this called The Halls of Montezuma. And in that game, Taylor is inferior to the Mexican generals Valencia and Santa Anna. He's the equal to the guy he defeated twice, Arista.
Wow.
Now, yeah, I don't agree with this. Now, Taylor was by far not some military genius. Men liked him because of his simple, direct manner. He was not as strict about discipline as Winfield Scott. In fact, later on in the campaign, he was known for running around in a white linen clothing with one of those big, like, kind of straw-looking hats that covers your whole face. Something, not exactly a sombrero like you're thinking of, but something like you might see in movies where you got guys working on a plantation.
Oh, like a cane hat, or?
I guess it might be. I guess that's what you would call it. But I mean, it's just, your general's not even running around in a uniform in some cases.
Well, I guess it was hot as shit.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Ulysses S. Grant admired both Scott and Taylor, but he really liked Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor was and you can see a lot of the influences of Taylor on Grant. Taylor was very good with logistics. At the same time, he had a simple, plain, direct manner. And when it came to battles, he was in no ways fancy. He would simply, in fact, both these battles, he was essentially fighting defensively and repelled the Mexicans. By the way, the Battle of Resaca del Palma, there is a park for it, but it's in the middle of Brownsville, Texas, just so you know. But anyways, so Taylor he's a decent commander. He's not some military genius. He's in that regard. He also reminds me of Grant tactically. They're both simple. He's going to set up his forces and do the best that he can. Grant was very much impressed with his bearing, as were a number of officers. So Taylor wins the opening 2 battles. This causes quite a shock in Mexico. And in the dispute between Arista and Ampudia, the government is going to support Ampudia over Arista. Arista is removed of command. He will play no more part in the war. Okay? Although he will eventually, like I said, after the war, become president. But that's beyond the purview of this. So
Does Ampudia ever become president? Oh.
No, he's not going to become president.
Opportunity missed, man.
Opportunity. They could have had the great, huh? Another thing I want to note about Taylor as well. Of course, Taylor had done very well in a number of conflicts. I want to say especially in the Seminole War. That being said, he didn't have as much War of 1812 experience as Zachary Taylor. He was only involved in really like 2 engagements. And he had experience there, but he did not come out of the War of 1812 with a big reputation. His reputation was enhanced by what he did after the War of 1812. All right, so enough with Zach Taylor. So those are the opening 2 battles. Americans are victorious. That allows them to secure Matamoros across from Brownsville, though Brownsville didn't really exist at the time, it was just Fort Brown. And the decision is going to be made to invade northern Mexico. But before I get into that, which is going to go into the Battle of Monterrey, one of the most brutal battles of this war, I did want to note a few things about the conquests of both New Mexico and California. All right. So, in the case of California, U.S. forces are sent over. California this time is sparsely populated with Mexican settlers. Many of them were already looking for a chance in independence. There were some skirmishes in California, but nothing really approaching a true battle. Probably the biggest one would be, let me see, Rio San Gabriel. No, not really that. I mean, some of the forces involved. No, these are all just kind of skirmishes, really. So anyways, California's taken relatively quickly. A lot of the American officers, by the time they arrive, are like, we have nothing to do here except occupation duty. For the purpose of the American Civil War, 3 officers in particular will be in California, who will lament the fact that they didn't really get involved in the major fighting, but they form a friendship that is important for the Civil War, and that is Henry Halleck, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Edward Ord. And of course, Halleck will shield Sherman during the war, and actually Ord as well, because Edward Ord, they eventually found letters where he was telling Jefferson Davis how much he liked him and how much he was regretting they were attacking the South. Yeah, they hid those away, though. And of course, both men have major military commands into the war in part because they're friends with Halleck. But anyway, California is secured relatively quickly. Another man who makes a name for himself with California is John C. Fremont, who crosses over into California just even before the war even starts and gets involved in the Bear Flag Republic. Do you guys know anything about the capture of California beyond that?
I mean, not much, but I do want to sort of emphasize, I was just looking at population before the war.
Yeah.
The number of sort of Mexican settlers in California and Alta California is like 8,000.
That's almost nothing.
I mean, and that's why you don't get a huge conflict, right? There are effectively some sort of missions out there on the coast, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Some of the and all these conflicts are on the coast. Like there was a siege at Los Angeles, for instance, which was one of the only Mexican victories. But all this stuff is short-lived. Mexico really doesn't have an army in this area. The settlers already there mostly don't want to be with Mexico, so This place is secured relatively quickly. One thing that's of note, though, the Americans did want to take Baja California
Right. Exactly.
and made numerous landings, but they did not have enough troops to hold it. So keep that in mind, everybody. That is actually one area where the Mexicans are successful. Although the degree to which it's because of them and more because of our own errors and because we just didn't have enough men there, because, getting troops to that side of the continent is going to be pretty difficult. Either you got to go by boat and you either got to round the Cape, or what you do is you cross men over from Panama and then you get on a boat on the other side and go up. I believe that's how Sherman got there. Or you could do what John C. Fremont did and go overland. Either way, it's difficult.
So with Baja California, was that more heavily settled at the time? Is that why Mexico was able to hold it better?
I believe so. I believe it was more heavily settled, but it was fairly sparsely settled compared to the rest of Mexico. One problem is the Americans, what troops they have are already committed to California. So they just don't have enough men. They did landing parties, they did seize some ports, but whenever a Mexican force would approach, they were just like, look, we just don't have enough men. And so I think you could make a case that with a few thousand more men, maybe they could have taken Baja.
Yeah, I was looking at the siege of Los Angeles, and the number of men posted there after the Americans took it briefly, temporarily, was 14 men. So, yes, they are hard up for men in California.
Wow.
Well, this gets at this question of distance, right? This is a huge land area. And logistics are better, but logistics are not good enough to deploy, tens of thousands of men to California from the Missouri, from the Mississippi River, right? So it's difficult to get people out there.
Well, not just that. The men are deployed there fine. The thing with logistics is going to be more about supporting Taylor's army.
Right.
Yeah, and that's really the main theater of action. And California, if anything, is us kind of seizing it opportunistically. I will say this battle of Rio San Gabriel, I say battle, okay, the forces involved were not inconsiderable for this war, but the casualties sure are. But man, it's got a really cool painting. That is a really impressive looking painting there.
What's the battle called again?
But yeah, Rio San Gabriel.
Okay.
And this by early 1847, California is secure. And once again, this was a weak part of the empire of the Mexican nation. The other one too, of course, is the New Mexico campaign. That actually saw quite a bit more fighting.
What happened there?
Well, remember, Santa Fe as a trading post is connected more to America. Columns come down of mounted infantry. One of the big leaders involved in this is going to be Sterling Price. Sterling Price, who later will be a prominent Confederate general. And the other one, whose name, God, I can never pronounce this dude's name. It's like Doniphan, Alexander Doniphan. Anyway, they secure New Mexico relatively easily. There are the battles here are a bit more considerable in numbers and casualties, but nothing comparable to what you're going to see with Taylor and Scott. Doniphan did lead a column across from New Mexico, across Arizona to get to California. And so a lot of what's impressive with this stuff is actually the logistics of it, of getting this many men across this area, and also keeping in mind you got the Comanche that are around as well.
Yeah.
I do not believe they really interfered with them during this. Philip St. George Cook was involved. Anyways, no, so this is also this is a tough campaign in terms of like weather and logistics. Fighting relatively minor. Santa Fe once again was more economically tied to the Americans, and this is one of these fringe areas in Mexico. People living there also once again don't like the governments that are in charge in Mexico City, so the Americans are generally accepted. That being said, there is a rebellion that will eventually happen in this area. That's called the Taos Revolt. Do you know much about that one, Michael? Because I do not.
I actually don't. No.
Yeah. You might want to look at that one. The rebellion was bloody, but was put down relatively quickly as well.
Hmm.
Okay, so wait, how bloody was it? Actually, it looks like the casualties on Wikipedia doesn't seem to be too high. And
Yeah.
I'm okay with Wikipedia on the Mexican War. They tend to be pretty good with the articles, unless it's about Pedro Ampuita. But anyways, no, this involved the Pueblo. It says.
Yeah.
So I thought you might know something about it. So I actually really didn't read
I
much on that
I
one.
actually no, I actually haven't read as much
Okay.
into the
I
Southwest
remember
history.
Bartek mentioned it
Hmm.
back during there. Uh, anyways, one of the things I was reading about was that for a lot of Americans, this was really one of their first big encounters with Mexican food and culture. One guy said this is the
Right.
first time his men ever ate a tortilla.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, no, logistically very well pulled off. The problem with California and New Mexico, though, is that these forces ultimately will not be able to assist the main theater. So it's not that these secondary theaters are unimportant. They most certainly are. They're securing the fringes of Mexico for the territory that will eventually be seized. But that being said, these campaigns really do not affect what is going on elsewhere outside of embarrassing the Mexican government. That's its main effect on the main campaigns. Now, leaving all of this stuff behind, let's get to the main event. Zachary Taylor had secured Matamoros, and now he's going to push into the interior of Mexico to advance on Monterrey and then Saltillo. Now, opposing him is Amputa. We'd already mentioned what he was like. Taylor, when he will confront him at Monterrey, the forces involved are relatively of the same number. 6,000 Americans, but 7,000 Mexicans. The Battle of Monterrey is a very, very bloody affair, a very ferociously fought affair. It actually involves street fighting, which is pretty rare for this era. The Americans do a complicated attack plan, barge their way into Monterrey. Okay. And then Taylor does something that caused a lot of controversy. He makes a deal with Amputa where he's allowed to occupy Monterrey. In return, there is a pause on hostilities where he cannot advance 50 miles.
Hmm.
The idea with this is so that the Mexicans can secure Saltillo. This is considered to be him stepping over his bounds, and by this time, Taylor was already being courted by Whigs, and Taylor was starting to give indications that he might want to run for president. So Polk essentially said, this is beyond your purview. You're not supposed to negotiate truces. All right. And by this time, Polk is starting to turn against Taylor.
Huh.
And you have to keep in mind this too. Polk and Winfield Scott did not get along. Now, Winfield Scott has been in Washington this entire time preparing a plan for a movement on Mexico City, because Scott understood that the northern Mexico campaign was a strategic dead end.
I really quickly wanted to ask you about the Battle of Monterrey, because this is a rare instance where I'm like, no, we got to get into more military history. But so I was reading about it, and it seemed like General Amputa like built a lot of pretty impressive fortifications in Monterrey, and Taylor led an assault on those fortifications, split his forces in two, and was able to take the town in that street fighting, and effectively overcome those fortifications despite equal numbers. And I thought that was kind of interesting. That seemed to be sort of more impressive than I had sort of previously read. I don't know if you read about that, but I was just curious about it.
Oh no, that's that this is there aren't that many towns in America named after the first two big battles of the war. The reason there's a number of towns named after this one. Because storming the fortifications is impressive, and doing those simultaneous attacks as well. I had to design a board game scenario for this years ago, and it was not easy. It hasn't been published yet, because it's such a complicated, involved battle. This one, because of what we said, where Taylor attacked fortifications. The anti-Taylor people hold that against him and say, "Look, this is proof that he's really not that good."
Wow.
Yeah, I don't think so. But also keep in mind too that where the numbers are equal, Arista's army was a decent quality army, or at least it had some good units in it. But then it suffers those heavy losses. Arista had to pull back. And Puta's army, of course, he's got some decent forces, but he also has a lot of them that really aren't. So by this time, the Mexican army is already starting to show that it's already becoming brittle. And while he did fortify those positions, there were some flaws in the fortifications apparently, and Amputa just didn't have good leadership skills.
Okay.
He was good at negotiations, though.
hence that weird scenario that you're talking about after the battle.
Yeah, like they make a deal. It's like, okay, you can have the town, but we don't have to fight for like 8 weeks. I think it's 8 weeks. I want to say.
So I wonder if Zach Taylor knew about Ampudia's pastimes of frying heads and all that.
He probably did. The main reason Taylor's doing this, from what I've read, is beyond the fact that he had not suffered crippling losses, but there were heavy losses. He had attacked a fortified position. But also, once again, goes to logistics. Marching the army here was very difficult.
Right.
And Taylor used that pause to get supplies. Okay? And to consolidate his position. The problem that you're really running into here is, where do you go from here? You can take Saltillo. Okay, cool. And keep it in mind too, the Americans did have an economic reason for coming in here. In fact, one of these books I read one time joked that the whole war might have just been really a battle over this economic zone in Mexico. Sure. So think about it. You might be able to get this area in negotiations. So if you think about it, Taylor is looking at this like, he doesn't know if he's going to be, he doesn't know if he's going to, if this area is going to become an American territory or not. So I don't think it's as strategically pointless as others say. However, these defeats are not enough to convince the Mexicans to sue for peace. They are enough to do a lot of damage to the Mexican government, and the president of Mexico is going to be overthrown around this time.
Right.
And that would be Moreno Paredes. And let me look up, when exactly was he kicked out? Yeah, like about 2 months before this. And there were revolts in Mexico. He pulls out, and then he was deposed as well. And the President Bravo was deposed as well as Salalas. Oh, Salalas. He got captured by Beauregard during the war. I remember his name. So anyways, so even though the Mexican government is having a lot of problems, they're still determined to fight this out. So Taylor's campaign is a strategic dead end as far as getting Mexico to surrender. But much like what they're doing in California and New Mexico, this is an area where you might be able to get more land when the war is over. Right. As far as my views on Taylor's attacks at Monterrey, I think actually they were pretty good. They were pretty bold as well. And also keep in mind, too, his other two battles had really been stay on the defensive, repel the Mexicans, then counterattack. This is one where he actually takes the offensive. Yeah. And a number of Civil War personalities would be this one, like Albert Sidney Johnston and Joseph Hooker and all the rest. Charles F. Smith. So anyways, but this is what gets him in trouble. What gets him in trouble with Polk. So then Polk starts being like, Scott, maybe we should give this guy a chance. And keep in mind, him and Scott do not like each other. They have very, very poor relations. But that's because Scott wants to become president. So not only does Scott see a chance to, in his opinion, take Mexico City and knock the Mexicans out of the war, but also get him in the White House. That's what he's also thinking of.
One other note on Zach Taylor's presidential aspirations. Apparently, it was well known enough in camp that one of the last letters Henry Clay Jr. sent to his dad, he said, "Hey, I think you should know Zach Taylor's almost certainly running for president in 48.
Wow.
And
yeah.
And I also wanted to point out, Sean, you mentioned earlier that Monterrey's sort of a military dead end because where do you go from here? Um, Mexico City is 600 miles to the south across multiple massive mountain ranges. That's the distance from New York City to Raleigh. So, I mean, there was sort of a strategic problem here that like with those even with those logistics, you're not gonna march an American army overland to Mexico City, and that sort of brings in Scott and Scott's plan here.
I think what really would yes, and I think what really when you look at what Taylor's doing, he's securing the border, the Rio Grande border, and securing possible future territory to be taken. So I once again don't view the strategic dead end. And also, the American government at this time is hoping that the victories on the Rio Grande border and this victory and New Mexico and California, this will be enough to convince the Mexicans to sue for peace.
Right.
And of course, it just isn't. All right. Now, one sec here. Let me see something. All right. I'm trying to get a take. Okay. All right. So, not long after this, Scott has already been developing his plans. And then here's deal with this one. Now, the U.S. Navy has already been seizing ports and doing blockades. A lot of their actions were, of course, there was Baja, and there was also Tabasco Coast. They also seized the town of Tampico, which is a little bit. Let me see, where's Tampico again? Yeah. Tampico is kind of like halfway between Veracruz and Matamoros. Now, what Scott is saying is that, look, you're doing a lot of economic damage to Mexico. You've seized territory, but if we can take Mexico City, that will break them down and convince them that they need to end the war. So Scott supported taking the important city of Veracruz, but he said it had to be with the idea that we're going to get to Mexico City,
Right.
to achieve a strategic victory. And it's telling that by this time, not only does Polk not trust Taylor, and probably in many ways feels like hoodwinked, like, hey, I thought you weren't into politics, right? He's going to figure to go with Scott because at this point also is when you start having more opposition to the war. Am I correct, gentlemen? Because then you get into late 1846 into 1847.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when exactly did Lincoln give that speech of his?
I believe it was November 1847. Let me take a look real quick.
Oh, wow. Man, he chose the wrong time for that one.
Well, he did and he didn't. Because, I mean, and this was one thing I wanted to point out as well. Over the course of this war, it's a fairly, like, violent war. So we had, like, the United States had sort of an active army of 70,000 troops over the course of the war. The casualty rate's fairly high. You have 13,000 American deaths, which as a percentage of the force is pretty substantial.
No, that's not quite as bad, really. 13,000, 70,000. I mean,
it's not great.
I'd say the rates were worse in the War of 1812 and the American Revolution. But I would also say those wars were probably generally more popular just because they're against the British, right? But even then, the American Revolution, not really, But there's a lot of death. I mean, also a lot of this death is from disease.
Yeah, it is. But sort of one thing that Greenberg writes about is there are lots of letters coming in about people killed in this war, and it's making an impact on the home front.
Okay.
Wait.
That's a great point, though, because by this time you've got a lot of newspapers out there, and the newspapers are praying these letters, and they do that during the Civil War as well. In fact, I like to say that your best source of information for a Civil War battle after the official reports is the newspapers where they print soldier letters, especially when the soldiers are writing anonymously, because they'll get really honest with you.
Yeah. So the speech is December 22nd, 1847.
Okay. Wow, man, that's coming later in, but by that time the war is wrapping up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so anyways, so the early defeats did cause problems in Mexico, but guess who's returning? Santa Anna.
Yep.
And he apparently comes back on the promise that Santa Anna's promise is that he'll go to Mexico and negotiate a peace and end the whole thing. Yeah, that ain't gonna happen. Yeah, so he arrives after Prodress's overthrow, and he will now be in charge. And Santa Anna, I will say this for him: he's going to lose about every battle he's involved in, but he's probably the Mexican general who shows the most ability during the war overall. And one thing is rallying the Mexicans to him and raising a very, very large army to go kick Scott out of North Mexico. Yeah. But actually, I do need to take another quick break. Sorry, everybody. So I'm going to go grab something. I'll be right back, okay?
No worries.
Okay. Yeah, I guess what I'll do is wait for Sean to come back, and then I'll take a break.
Oh, okay. Or you could take a break right now. That'd be fine.
Yeah, I could do that. Last time I tried to take a break, I played like some G.I. Joe thing as a joke, and then it got copyright struck immediately.
Gosh.
So I'm not going to do that. Anyway, so I'll just leave you to your devices then.
All right, sounds good.
Be right back.
As a quick note, while we're waiting on them to come back, one very interesting thing about the campaign Scott will take into Mexico City in 1847 is it follows a fairly similar route to the route that Hernan Cortez took to Tenochtitlan in the 1510s. So there are some sort of very interesting geographic overlaps here from 300 years ago. So there's sort of a reason Scott originally sort of bases his campaign from Veracruz. But we will talk about that shortly. So I guess I'll monologue a little bit while waiting for people to get back. So one of the books that Greenberg writes is actually a biography of Sarah Polk, and she is seen as sort of heavily involved in James K. Polk's administration, and is actually will actually help coordinate Democratic politics for him. And so while James Polk is sitting at his desk, sort of obsessing about the war, Sarah Polk is sort of controlling access to who gets to see him, and is sort of playing games of Democratic politics in terms of who has access to the president. So it's a pretty interesting sort of relationship that Greenberg details, and a much more, as a first lady, Sarah Polk's involved much more than sort of a typical first lady at the time. So, and I see Sean's back, so we can go back to the military history.
Yeah.
Didn't know that about Sarah Polk really, but then again, I don't know James K. Polk in as great a detail. Let me see something right here. Okay, so where I left off is that Santa Anna raises a large army. He wants to push Taylor out of North Mexico, and this leads to the Battle of Buena Vista. Buena Vista, by this time, Taylor did not have many of his regulars. See, Scott is trying to get every regular he can to be with the force that's going to land at Veracruz, then march on Mexico City. So mostly volunteers are left with Taylor, although he does have some regular army batteries, uh, which are led by two generals of particular note, two future generals of particular note, George Thomas and Braxton Bragg. So, anyways, Santa Anna's army is large, enthusiastic, but they immediately have problems in the march north because of logistical breakdowns. Also, these are not very well trained men. Once again, they're having the gunpowder crisis, so a lot of these guys have not really fired their guns too much. Still, it looks like they're going to win. I mean, Santa Anna has almost a 4-1 advantage on them, at least a 3-1. This battle is bloody. The Mexicans launch a series of furious attacks. Now, American casualties are, for a battle of this war, the American casualties are fairly high. We're talking like around 600 to 700. But the Mexicans, they're going to lose like over 2,000 men in this thing. And one of the things the Battle of Buena Vista really showed was this one really shows superiority of American artillery. You can make a case that was really American artillery that won this one in particular. And this actually leads to one of Taylor's campaign slogans, because he went to Braxton Bragg and his order was double shot your cannon, Bragg, and give them hell. Now, you can't make that a campaign slogan back then. So instead, they gave it they instead renamed it a little more grape, Captain Bragg. Bragg one time said that throughout the 1850s, people would ask him what did Taylor say exactly, and he'd say, "I don't remember saying much of anything," or "I think it was this, double shot your cannons and give them hell." Thomas also does very, very well with the artillery here. So the American artillery blasts these Mexicans who are just like attacking in waves. Horrendous losses. Santa Anna breaks off. This battle, tactically, of course, is very impressive for the Americans. Oh, by the way, Jefferson Davis was in the battle too. He did very well with the Mississippi Rifles. But one can make a case that this battle was a draw strategically. Taylor's army was so mauled that he never again undertook any type of offensive action. Now, you could say his options were rather limited on what he could do to begin with. That's what I would say. And plus, he still holds the area that he has. So I believe actually strategically an American victory, but the Mexicans did give Taylor enough of a bloody nose to where he is going to be inactive for the rest of the war. On the other hand, though, this is arguably America's most impressive victory. And remember, it's almost all volunteers doing it. Now, Derek, you were talking about this idea of like the American officers are sissies, right?
Well, at least the regulars. I don't know if they felt that way about the officers too. Although
Well, yeah.
probably.
So this is the kind of battle that is tailor-made for the American psyche. Because remember, the American memory, their idea of the American Revolution was a bunch of guys behind trees shooting stupid Brits in redcoats. And that extended to the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans, we won that battle through mostly artillery. We had a lot of heavy cannons, and we blasted the British. Their casualty reports show that almost all the injuries were from artillery. The American popular imagination, though, was always a bunch of dirty shirt frontiersmen from Kentucky and Tennessee with their long rifles, picking them off, right?
Yeah.
And don't be wrong, the rifles definitely played a part in the victory at the Battle of New Orleans, particularly targeting officers. For instance, that's how Packingham went down. But actually, the actual soldiers, they're getting mauled by artillery first and foremost. And so a battle like this, where you have this officer is already known as rough and ready, right? And is known for his plain, direct manner. And he even doesn't even wear a uniform sometimes. And he leads a bunch of volunteers to victory over an overwhelming Mexican horde. This is the battle that captured the American imagination most during the era.
That makes sense. And I guess also it's worth mentioning that two of the casualties are actually probably three, but there's only two that Greenberg covered. But Henry Clay Jr. and Hardin both died in this battle, and they were both commemorated for several years afterwards with large public ceremonies, newspaper editorials, uh, eulogies, you name it. And so this battle got commemorated in different ways over and over and over. So it makes sense that if you just keep mentioning it, even in the connection to people who were there or in its own right, yeah, it's going to become kind of legendary. And yeah, like you're saying, it is like this idea of a handful of Americans fighting a little Thermopylae-esque action where they're massively outnumbered, but their Americanness prevailed, and they repelled the Mexicans and stood their ground.
Yeah. Although, wait, was George Thomas there? I think he was. I'm gonna make sure. Actually, guys, let me make sure of that one right now. Just I don't want to overstep. I know George Thomas led artillery during the Mexican War and did quite well.
If I'm not mistaken, also didn't Lee serve with both Taylor and Scott?
I know Grant did. I don't know about Lee. I'll check that right quick as well. Uh, yeah, Buell did service with both as well, and Buell came out of the war with a really high reputation. No, no, I didn't think so, but no, Lee was with Scott.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I thought that anyway. But let me check on Thomas real quick. Yeah, Thomas was at Buena Vista. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never knew
So
Thomas
the-
was an artilleryman by training.
One of the reasons I think Thomas, one argument I've heard for Thomas being so good in the Civil War was that he was one of the only generals who, in the antebellum army, had experience with cavalry, infantry, and artillery in combat.
Wow.
Huh.
Although artillery is what he was most associated with. No.
Interesting.
So Buena Vista is a really important battle for America politically. I think this is the battle really where he's like the guy saying Taylor's going to run. This is the battle where Taylor becomes president.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and it can't lie. It's a damn impressive victory. And keep in mind, we suffered very heavy losses. The Mexicans did this. This is one of the battles, and the Mexicans came the closest to winning of all the major battles.
And if they
Monterrey, while Monterrey was well fortified, the army wasn't of the best quality, and their leader wasn't very good. It just the position itself was fortified and was going to be a tough nut to crack unless somebody really messed up. But this is one that the Mexicans should have won.
and honestly, if they did win it, it could have changed the results of the war, perhaps.
Yes, I think so. Because you would have had Santa Anna with a large army that could have recrossed the Rio Grande. And keeping in mind, most of the army is being gathered for Scott's attack. So that would have had to divert men away from the Veracruz landing. You know? But once again, the one benefit the Mexicans do get from this battle is Taylor's army is effectively neutralized for the rest of the year. They're not going to be doing any. They're not going to do any more damage.
So Taylor's army will remain in this area for the rest of the war, then?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Huh.
Yeah.
So
anyway.
shall we transition to Scott then? Just looking at the time.
Oh yeah. No, we're down for Scott now. Okay.
We gotta get to the end of the war.
Yeah. No.
Just like America.
So anyway, yeah, and keep in mind too, I'm doing this war in the broad strokes. I mean, I could one day do a whole stream on like Scott's campaign in particular, but just so you know, Scott lands at Veracruz. The fortress is captured after a rather long siege. After that, Scott advances into the interior to the city of, I'm pronouncing it Jalapa. I'm pretty sure it's probably pronounced some other way. But once there, he's going. Santa Anna by that time is already rushing down away, because what happened at Buena Vista. It's also been said that one of the reasons the Americans won was because Santa Anna knew about the political situation in Mexico, and that he had to withdraw, and then he never returned because he has to go deal with Scott. There is some truth to that. Santa Anna might have tried on the second day of battle, but the point is he didn't, and he suffered horrific losses. At any rate, though, the Battle of Cerro Gordo, I believe, is in some ways the turning point of the war, because both the Mexican and American armies are fairly evenly matched numerically. Santa Anna does have troops that have been in a battle, so he's got veterans at least this time, and he takes him a pretty good defensive position. But here's the thing about Scott. Scott did something real smart. He had this group called he called the Engineer Company, and these men worked as engineers, scouts, and as planners and part of his staff. They were all West Pointers, personally chosen by Scott. All of these men after the war will become generals, Union and Confederate. Although the three most famous generals in the engineering company will be Robert E. Lee, P.G.T. Beauregard, George McClellan. So what they did at Cerro Gordo is Beauregard figures out how to outflank the position. And then Lee steps in, but Beauregard, I think he got sick or something happened where he had to be in a tent, and then Lee completed the scouting. Scott sets up a well-prepared artillery bombardment, turns the Mexican position, and doesn't just beat them. He inflicts 4,000 casualties on them and loses all under 500. Most of those are prisoners. After this battle, Scott said, Mexico has no army. It's oftentimes considered to be Winfield Scott's best battle. I very much agree with that. And I also think that if the Americans if the American attacks had failed, you could have had almost like not a Buena Vista in reverse, but a situation where the Americans took too heavy a losses to keep going. So in Mexico, I mean, Santa Anna will never have an army of this quality again. Not that it was like the best quality army, but the Mexican army will never be this good again. And that's actually why there's no battles for months after this, because Santa Anna has to spend his entire time trying to rebuild the army. At the same time, Scott advanced his army to Pueblo and then paused there. And the reason he's pausing is to regroup, wait for reinforcements, and make sure his supplies are fine. Now, one of the things that happens throughout this campaign is the Mexicans will have guerrillas and other forces attack Scott's supply lines. So a lot of Scott's army is detailed guarding wagons and garrisoning certain towns. One thing Scott was big on during this campaign was to make sure that he believed that if they started doing any kind of atrocities, that the Mexican people would rise up against them in a popular revolt. And he wanted to avoid the fate essentially that befell Napoleon in Russia. So the American army throughout Scott's campaign adheres to strict discipline in its relations with civilians. Those who violated this discipline, some of them were executed, those who committed rape or whatnot. And they also, instead of just taking stuff from Mexican civilians, would pay for it. Now, there, of course, are still guerrillas who are going to fight them. There are, of course, some bad run-ins with the locals. But Scott was really smart for doing that. So there is not like a popular upswell of we got to kick the Americans out. I mean, not in such a way that would have made this impossible. And that's one of the things I think why Wellington thought this wouldn't work, is because you're in this, tropical region. You're going to be hit with the diseases. And he's also probably thinking of what happened with Napoleon in Spain. And to be fair, that is what the Mexicans rely on. Santa Anna was hoping that guerrillas and other ones would destroy Scott's supply lines, but they don't. The supply situation is difficult, mind you. All right, they have to pull in more troops. Got to have a lot of troops guarding those supply lines. But in terms of logistics, this is a masterful campaign.
And worth to note, Puebla's up in the mountains, so it's not like the rainforests near Veracruz. This is just from a climate perspective.
Yes. Very, 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 very true. Remember, landing at Veracruz, I forgot to mention, that was in March of 1847, so not yellow fever time.
You don't want to stay around during the summer, and so timing here is critical.
But the thing is, you pause at Puebla during the summer. You build up your supplies as well. A lot of the soldiers also talked about being in pueblos in the mountains, so they could just see so far out, see so much of Mexico sweeping before them. The Army's morale does go up, the Army's morale, both from the victory and from this rest, goes up very, very high.
And
so,
it's
smart move.
And I did also want to mention that discipline is crucial for another reason, because as we mentioned earlier in the stream, Taylor does not have much discipline over his troops.
No, he doesn't.
And there are war crimes committed that are entering the American press at the time and that are starting to galvanize Whig opposition to this war.
Yeah, not to mention, like, I guess the assumption by almost everybody in Taylor's army or about Taylor's army is that, like, every guy who came back probably raped somebody.
It's pretty bad. I mean, it is pretty brutal. There are significant war crimes committed against civilian populations, and that's bothering people at the home front. I mean, that's getting into newspapers.
Yeah, glad you mentioned that one because I knew there were war crimes committed in New Mexico. I didn't know the extent with Taylor. I knew with Scott they were strictly against it.
Yeah, but it will get worse after Mexico City too, because that's when things change, and when there's not an immediate peace after Mexico City falls, the troops get pretty restless and a lot of them start to question why they're even there.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
That's where you get problems with occupation.
Yeah. No, one other thing too is, by the way, the fact that Scott has a lot of success with this policy with civilians is also one of the influences on the early part of the American Civil War. Some officers looked to Scott and said, "Hey, we should not be going to the South freeing slaves and taking food." You know, and a lot of them are citing what Scott did in the advance to Mexico. But at any rate, though, the advance will resume, and this is going to lead to the battles of Canteras and Churubusco, which I think means place of the war god. A pretty cool name, right? So at any rate, though, yeah, this what happens is they're maneuvering against Mexico City. Instead of going directly at it, they're going to swing south and take it from that position. Now, Canteras, that position was held by a general named Gabriel Valencia. Valencia and Santa Anna are rivals. Sometimes they allied with each other, apparently, but overall they're rivals. So there you do. You have two men who are looking to see who's going to be the leader of Mexico after this. Well, Santa Anna kind of is the leader, but you get what I'm trying to say. So there's very poor communication between the two men. Canteras is one of the most interesting battles of the war. The Americans, when they find the Mexican position, there's this lava bed called the Pedregal, and what happens is Beauregard and Lee find a path skirting along the position, Pedregal. So the Americans build a makeshift road. The Mexicans don't really, I mean, they do some skirmishing apparently, but they don't really attack them while they're making this road. The Americans use that to outflank the Mexican army and then attack them at dawn. The dawn attack routs the Mexican army in less than 30 minutes. This is like the San Jacinto of the war. So Valencia's army is swept away. Losses are almost 3,000 for the Mexicans in this one. In fact, it's most of the force that the Americans confronted. By the way, this battle also led to a lot of places being named after it in America. And Beauregard's family will rename their plantation from Toutant Nord, I believe it was originally called, to Canteras, which is what the site is known as today.
Wow. So there's some pretty impressive tactical victories in this war.
Very much so. However, here's the sticky one though. Churubusco, what happens is Scott is going after Santa Anna's army, and that is him attacking his rear guard. Now, before that, fun little incident for you. Beauregard came up to Scott to tell him about the victory at Canteras and what they had done, and then Scott says to him, "My lad, if I wasn't on horseback, I would embrace you." And Beauregard in his account is like, "I've never heard better words in my life," or something, you know. By the way, right after this, Beauregard captured a few hundred Mexicans led by Salas. Salas was one of Santa Anna's generals and supporters. And he had actually said, "We must kill every American. We must hang them all." And then Beauregard finds him and his men essentially just after the Battle of Canteras kind of hiding out in a building. And he says, he just looks at him and he goes up to one of the officers and tells him he says, "There's a canary in your cage," essentially. So, so very impressive victory. Churubusco, not as much. The Americans attack, and they do seize the position and destroy Santa Anna's rear guard, but with heavy losses. This is the battle where they lost something like over 1,000 men. Most notably, the San Patrico Battalion was involved. San Patrico Battalion was made up of Irish who were fighting for the Mexicans, many of them deserters from the American Army.
Right.
Yeah, and apparently
Yeah.
they started trying to recruit them as soon as they landed at Veracruz. So the local commandant printed all flyers in Spanish and English, and they were trying to
Yeah.
subvert as many American Catholics as possible.
Yes. They made a movie about this with Tom Berenger, by the way. I've never seen it. My dad
Really?
liked it, but I've never seen it. But no, so the San Patrico's battalion though were damn good fighters, ferocious fighters. And but Churubusco is one of the bloodiest. It's for the Americans one of the most furiously fought battles. Now, there could be a point made that Scott's tactics here did not work. He essentially lunged right at the enemy. His men took heavy losses, but it does break. It does. How should I say this? The Mexican rear guard, though, is thoroughly mauled, and Santa Anna is, because of a battle like this, is forced to keep on retreating.
Right.
So I think that's worth noting. This is, I wouldn't call it a Pyrrhic victory, but it's definitely a messy victory. But so there you go, Michael. Well, the first two I mentioned were these really impressive tactical achievements. This one is not it.
Right.
But you also
And
think about from the American point of view, they won two major battles in the same day. So the Americans
yeah.
are coming to Mexico City being like, man, we got this, you know?
And I think that's sort of the interesting part of the story that I actually hadn't known until today, until I was sort of reading up for the stream. So this secures Mexico City for the Americans, right? And Santa Anna's army flees. Sorry, am I jumping ahead?
No, not quite yet. Okay.
Okay.
We're getting damn close there. Okay, we're getting pretty close. When they get to Mexico City, Santa Anna calls for a truce. Scott agrees because he needs to consolidate his forces. Santa Anna used that time to fortify Mexico City. During this time, the Americans are doing a number of scouting missions. Then Scott fights what is considered to be his worst battle, the Battle of Molino del Rey. That's an attack on a fortified Mexican position right outside of Mexico City. The Mexican commander, though, Antonio Leon, he really rallied the men to him, gave him like speeches like, we're gonna fight, we're gonna stand here, and we're gonna die, and they do. The Mexican force takes heavy losses again, but the Americans also take heavy losses. Beauregard, in his account of Mexico, talks about how this was Scott's most poorly done battle. William J. Worth, who was Scott's second in command. Worth is a very good general, by the way, one of the best of the war. Worth afterwards was very much dejected as he was heavily involved. Who was the other one? There was another guy, I think Ethan Allen Hickok, who was Ethan Allen Hickok said, another battle like this and we've lost the war. So the mood in the American army is actually very low after Molino del Rey. They're like, we've taken heavy losses. We've scouted Mexico City. It's well fortified. How the hell are we going to take this place? So Scott, right afterwards, has a council of war. And in this council of war, he asks all the officers for their opinion, but he makes it clear during the council, he says, this is not a council to talk about retreat. All right? We are here to fight and win this. We are going to attack Mexico City. Most of the generals and the engineering guys say attack from the south, the southern gate. I think Twiggs said, why don't we attack Chapultepec? Chapultepec could only really be attacked from one side. I know about this part in detail because of the Beauregard biography. Well, apparently during the meeting, Beauregard was quiet. Scott asked an opinion, and then Beauregard says, attack Chapultepec, they won't see it coming. And then Franklin Pierce, who had already befriended Beauregard, says, yes, I agree. That's what we should do. And Scott goes with Pierce and Beauregard and Twiggs. I have my own little thing where I suspect Scott was going to attack Chapultepec anyway, because the attack on Chapultepec was set up by the Battle of Molino del Rey. So I think he's like, hey, if I don't take Chapultepec, it's going to look like I just wasted my time. So Scott would always claim, I need to take Molino del Rey so I can take Chapultepec. Anyway, Chapultepec is stormed in dramatic fashion. This is another pretty damn bloody affair here. The Mexican forces defending included cadets. The Americans, by the way, did not capture the flag per se because one of the Mexicans wrapped the flag of the fortress around him and jumped off the ramparts.
Damn.
Yeah, yeah. Um, oh God, I remember the incident. Like when the American flag goes up at Chapultepec, Santa Anna's seeing it, and he said something like, the Yankees could storm heaven, and then somebody said God. When the flag goes up, he said, well, apparently God is a Yankee.
Huh.
So the defenders of Chapultepec believed they were going to hold on, and to be fair, they looked like they were at first. The Americans were pinned down. One of the advantages the Americans had at Chapultepec was they had light infantry riflemen who were led by Joseph E. Johnston. One incident during the battle, Beauregard, to raise morale, went up to Johnston and said, "How much would you bet I can hit that Mexican right there, like right in front of the men?" Because Johnston himself was an excellent shot. So that's how they stormed the position. With this, Mexico City's fall is all but guaranteed, but the fighting is not actually over yet. Because then you got to attack the gates of Mexico City. There's some pretty ferocious fighting involved with that, but ultimately the gates are penetrated. Mexico City does fall. And at that point, I'm going to... Do you guys have any questions for me or anything?
No.
Y'all good?
No,
All right.
it's fairly
I'm going to
comprehensive.
hand it off to you two to talk about occupation and peace.
Yeah, and I think that's the sort of interesting thing is, so Mexico City falls, and the Americans were like, okay, war over, took the capital, it's all done. And it's not, because Santa Anna refuses, in the immediate aftermath of this, refuses to surrender, sort of retreats. And this is where you get a lot more opposition to the war, because now you have an occupation that is lasting longer than people expected. And I'm happy to talk about this. I don't know, Thersites, if you wanted to jump in.
One last thing to note, though, one thing that'll hurt Santa Anna was at the same time he was trying to take Pueblo. Remember that city in the mountains?
Yeah.
The attempt to take Pueblo does fail.
Hmm.
Do you make a case that if he had taken Pueblo, he could keep the war going? But this definitely hurts Santa Anna's position. But otherwise, go ahead, take it away, guys.
Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in, Thersites, or let me talk about this.
You can keep going.
Okay. So yeah, this battle, the capture of Mexico City is in, I believe, late September, like September 26, 1847. The treaty is not concluded until February 2nd, 1848. So you have this awkward occupation where you have American soldiers sitting in Mexico City, many of whom want to go home, as we've talked about those very brief enlistment, right? 3 months enlistments. So many American soldiers are not expected to stay there, and morale does start to plummet a little bit. What makes it worse is that, at least for the Americans' position, that those American deserters who fought for the Mexican army, the San Patricios, I believe, 3 of them are actually hung by Scott in the middle of Mexico City, which really pisses off the civilian population. And so you have situations where American soldiers are still continuing to be killed during this occupation due to guerrilla attacks. And you're also having situations of American soldiers, committing war crimes against Mexican civilians. And so there is this sort of desperation from Winfield Scott and from others to try to conclude this war as fast as possible, because they see this sort of occupation as not tenable, and as putting a lot of pressure on the American position. And this is where we should introduce our friend Nicholas Trist.
Yep.
And Thersites, feel free to jump in whenever. I don't want to sort of hog the story.
Well, it came to Mexico on a tryst of sorts.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Came to Mexico on the Trist. So Nicholas Trist is sent on a secret mission by James K. Polk to negotiate a treaty with Mexico and end the war. And Polk sees Trist as a very non-political person who is trustworthy. And keep in mind, Polk at this moment is like super like paranoid about most people, not only in his cabinet but also in the army, because he as was already mentioned, he's like Zachary Taylor's going to run for president, and he's going to do so off these big victories. So he wants to send a negotiator who has zero political ambitions. And Trist doesn't have a whole lot of political ambitions, but Trist also doesn't really fully believe in the political aims of this war. But has kind of held his cards sort of tight and not really told that to Polk. So Polk is sending Trist down to essentially try to get as much territory for Mexico as possible. And one sort of key piece of territory that Polk really wants is Baja California. And so Polk is pushing for a treaty that's not only going to annex New Mexico, California, out to California, or Northern California, but also Baja California and the entire Baja Peninsula. And also, if Trist could get some more Mexican territory of Northern Mexico, that would be great too. So that's kind of the goal. But as Trist travels down to Mexico and hears sort of the stories of the Mexican War, and travels with Scott's army, he is sort of convinced that this is a sort of immoral war. And he doesn't actually really want to push for a treaty where the United States takes a lot of territory from Mexico. In fact, he's almost he almost thinks that the sort of ideal scenario is the United States shouldn't take much of any territory from Mexico. That's his own personal beliefs, but he feels like he has to negotiate a treaty that still has some territorial concessions. And this is where things sort of get interesting in terms of the politics between Trist and Scott. Because when Trist shows up, Scott and Trist hate each other. Because Trist shows up, gets super sick in Scott's camp, and starts to sort of act sort of haughty towards Whitfield Scott, sends some letters to him basically saying, I've been put on a mission to negotiate a treaty with Mexico. Here are the orders from Polk. You need to follow them. And Scott gets kind of pissed off at him, basically. But once the army moves and occupies Mexico City, they're sort of in both of their interests sort of merge. As Scott does not want a long occupation of Mexico City. He's essentially worried that this occupation is going to get out of hand. He's worried about guerrilla combat, so he wants to end the war as fast as possible. And so does Trist. And so there is sort of this big overture between them. Trist, who has continued to actually sort of get infected with multiple diseases and is not in the greatest of health during this trip. Scott actually gives him a bunch of medicine, puts him up in a nice place at Mexico City, and Trist sort of really appreciates that. And so they kind of come to a conclusion where Scott's like, okay, yeah, you go negotiate this treaty. We're going to support you for it. And so Trist starts negotiating with the Mexican moderates who aren't like fully on Santa Anna's side at this point, and also realize, based off this sort of military history of conflict, the Mexican army has lost a lot of battles. The capital's occupied, and now they have a negotiator in Trist who is not pushing the gambit on trying to annex a lot of core Mexican territories. And so they're like, this is probably the best deal we're going to get. We should really sit down and negotiate a deal with Trist. Now, I mentioned originally that this diplomatic mission was supposed to be a massive secret, right? Polk says, okay, Trist, keep this a secret. This is not a secret. In fact, this is one of the most publicized diplomatic missions in American history. Because the moment Trist leaves off of on an American ship going down to Mexico, reports start getting published. Nicholas Trist is on a quest to negotiate a treaty with Mexico, and so you constantly have these newspaper reports coming out about what Trist is doing, including a whole fictional series, which is kind of nuts at the time. And so here Polk is like, I've sent my man on a secret mission to Mexico, and it's getting widespread publicity in the United States. And so Polk is like feeling horribly betrayed by Trist at this moment, and actually sort of sends orders to Trist to say, I am revoking your status. You are not to negotiate a treaty with Mexico. Come back here. And Trist basically says, no, I'm not going to. He writes a 65-page letter back to Polk saying, here are the reasons why I think I need to go ahead and negotiate this treaty, and I'm going to do that. And this is going effectively against the orders of the President of the United States at the time. So this is a war that is entered quite controversially. And so Trist gets into the negotiations with Mexican negotiators. They come up with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Guadalupe Hidalgo, of course, is a place of a site of pretty important symbolic importance to the Mexican government, and to the Mexican people rather. And in it, Trist only pushes for annexing California, most of the territory of the Mountain West, and then of course Texas. But he does not notably push for the annexation of Baja California. And Trist is doing this because he knows that if he does not push for annexation of California, and the territories that are eventually in New Mexico and of course Texas, that this will not be accepted by Polk, or more importantly by Congress. And so he's doing what he thinks is the minimum necessary to end this war and to get Congress to approve this. He doesn't even really want to push for the annexation of these territories, and he writes that he feels really bad about doing so, which is really sort of interesting. And so how is this treaty received? So this treaty is sort of submitted back to Washington, and the Senate has to approve it. So how is it received? Well, you have significant opinions across American society about this. So I believe one of the comments, someone mentioned in a comment, the all of Mexico movement. Raffleson mentioned, what do you make of the all of Mexico movement? Well, so there were these radicals who basically push to annex all of Mexico. And so on one side, you have these sort of fairly radical extremists saying we should take all of Mexico, right? So they see the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and they're sort of horrified by it. They're like, what? We won all these wars. We're occupying the capital. What are you talking about? Like, this is the minimum of what we should have. Well, we should be annexing all of Mexico, right? So that's sort of one group. Then you have another group of incredibly anti-war Whigs who have gotten all of those reports about like massacres of not only Mexican civilians but of course U.S. troops, and they see this war as horribly immoral, right? And this gets to Abraham Lincoln's spotty Abraham Lincoln's speech about where's the exact spot where American blood was shed on American soil, and Abraham Lincoln basically says, look, this wasn't the case. This war was started with the U.S. Army invading a disputed territory where there should not have been. And this is a war of aggression, and it's a legal war. And so these sort of most principled Whigs look at this war and they say, the U.S. shouldn't be annexing any Mexican territory whatsoever. And so those are the extremes. And then you have this treaty that basically sort of splits the difference. And senators debate it and sort of a debate essentially how much of Mexico should be annexed. But all of this is happening within the context of the occupation of Mexico City, of increasing guerrilla warfare, and of an army that really does not want to be in this war anymore. Scott and his troops won out, and they want a peace. And that is sort of important context for why the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is accepted, even when President Polk himself is pissed off at Trist for even negotiating it, and feels like the United States is effectively being shortchanged. So that's sort of political context. Do you guys want to add anything on that?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. So it
Yeah.
really. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, just to say on my end, that was an excellent summation of that. Excellent summation of that. Especially the part about why he chose Nicholas Trist, because I wondered the same thing. I was like, wait, why is he choosing this guy?
Yeah. Well,
because it's not like his name doesn't really come up a whole lot outside of this incident. Outside the negotiations.
And it's worth to mention quickly his political background. So Nicholas Trist is considered sort of a protege of Thomas Jefferson and of the sort of Virginia, Virginia Democratic Republicans, and seen basically as a sort of Jeffersonian moderate Democrat, effectively.
Okay.
And sort of high-minded, apolitical type. He is not a Jacksonianite or something like that. For Polk, who's worried both about political ambitions within the Whigs and also political ambitions within his own party, he's looking at Buchanan being like, hey, dude, you're being way too political. I'm not comfortable with you running to run for president, right?
Yeah.
He sees someone like Trist as like, oh my gosh, he's a unicorn. Someone who doesn't want to be president.
Yeah, also somebody who always, his main concern apparently was always about, I just want some free time. I'm sick of working so much. I want to spend time with my family.
Oh yeah, that's a good thing to add
I'm
here.
glad you mentioned that. That reminded me of the Abraham Lincoln thing where he sent Sherman to command the army in the Army of the Ohio. And Sherman's getting sent out west, and he looks at Lincoln and says, look, I'm going to go to Kentucky as your orders, but please don't put me in charge of an army. And Lincoln was like, you're the first officer I've met who's like, don't put me in charge of an army.
Yeah. And
then he puts Sherman in charge of the army because Robert Anderson resigns. But anyways, no, God, that's very interesting. Sorry. So the one thing I wanted to ask you about is, there's the chapter in the Howard Zinn book about the Mexican War. It's called "We Take Nothing by Conquest, Thank God." And I mentioned that because we gave Mexico money for the territories, correct?
Yeah.
And was that something that Polk wanted, or was that a Trist move?
No,
that was a Polk move.
Actually, yeah, Polk authorized $30 million to ensure that Baja California is included in this. So one clever thing Trist did, he's like, okay, shoot, he's like, I don't want us to annex Baja California. So let's negotiate down that cost. And so Trist basically negotiates the money down to $15 million.
Okay.
And that sort of stuff matters because basically Polk gets this from a courier at 9 p.m. at night. By the way, the courier makes it from Mexico City to Washington, D.C. in something like 18 days, which is incredibly fast given communication lines. He comes to D.C. He comes to I think he came to Buchanan's house, and then Buchanan goes to Polk. He comes to Buchanan's house not having bathed in several days or something like that. So the guy was just moving constantly, trying to get this treaty signed as fast as possible. And so Polk gets this thing, and he apparently spends the whole night reading over it. This gets also into Polk's ruining his health by basically obsessing and micromanaging this stuff. So when he originally gets the treaty, he's pissed. He's like, there's no way I'm going to accept this. Apparently by the morning hours, he's looking at this and Yeah, I didn't get Baja, but to be honest, this is a fairly reasonable treaty, and I'm kind of forced to accept it.
I mean, to be fair,
Yeah.
Trist did get it at a discount. He spent half the money he had available.
Yeah,
Which,
that's
I mean,
right.
$15 million for all the shit he took is, even by the standards of that time and the value of currency, I mean, that's still a crazy deal.
And this is before the Mexicans learn that gold was discovered in California, which is a key thing, right? Because
Oh
there's
yeah.
no way
God,
they
that happened.
accept that deal if that's the case.
That happens like the next year too.
Yeah, yeah. I think it was literally 3 months.
Man. Oh,
Yeah,
guess what? I think I have to read. I want to read about this again. But I believe when they first found gold, they brought it to Sherman, and he said that's not gold.
that's fine.
So, I'm you know what? Actually, don't quote me that. I'm gonna look at the details on that. But apparently, Sherman was given one of the initial gold things. He was like, "That's not gold," and he delayed the find by a few weeks by his declaration or something.
Oh, did he think it
I'll
was
check that.
fool's gold, or?
Something like that. But yeah, I mean, Sherman's the kind of guy if like some guy comes down the mountains like, "I found gold," he's like, "Yeah, right."
So Sherman was kind of a skeptic, but maybe also a bit of a contrarian then?
To the max.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I need to step away for just. But Thersites, did you want to talk really briefly about sort of Whig opposition to this war? And then maybe
Yeah,
we can go into like slavery and the consequences of it.
so there were a number of Whig politicians who opposed the war all the way through, and of course, one of the leading voices during this time was a former president, John Quincy Adams, who was at this time the most respected anti-slavery voice in the Congress. And there were a number of people who voted against the war resolution. I think they called themselves like the Immortal 11 or 14, or however many there were. So it included Quincy Adams and his protege, whose name I can't remember, and a few others. And so they were trying to rally opposition. And of course, as reports of atrocities on the front come in, they're able to do that. So they're able to play into concerns about degrading the morality of Americans. And also, they're able to play up the original casus belli as having been false.
Mm.
Some of them would even go so far as to say the war should be ended with a treaty that takes nothing, because the war was fought on false premises. Of course, that view will not quite have legs, but the point is that they were really starting to put together a cohesive response to Polk, because Polk caught them off guard with the war. Again, out of all the congressmen, only 14 voted against. So with the Whigs, they, I believe, were arguing that all the money and effort should have gone into domestic improvement and infrastructure.
Yes, yes, internal improvements. That is the rallying cry of Henry Clay.
Yeah, and so that's starting to mount now, and also more and more voices are slowly coming to their side. So John Quincy Adams will die during this time. I think he dies right around the same time as the treaty, maybe a bit before or after. But one major voice will join them around this time, and that will be Henry Clay. So Henry Clay's been rather silent on the war up to this point because of his son going to fight in it. But he did make a smart-ass remark in New Orleans that got reported, where he said, "Man, I wish I could go kill a Mexican." So he's kind of mocking the war fever. But it was reported in a way that made him look like a hypocrite, because it's like, well, where are you then? Why aren't you down there? But he was being sarcastic. Anyway, so once Clay joins in, now you've got one of the heavy hitters, and he also said in a speech, well, I'd rather be right than be president, because everybody understood his lifelong ambitions to be president. But effectively, he's going to Kentucky in Lexington, which was very pro-war at the time, and he was speaking against the war. So he was taking what he was posturing as a really moral stand. And you're starting to pick up steam with that, too, because Clay's a very persuasive speaker and has a lot of pull. And so, if you're the Polk government, at this point, there is kind of an imperative to end the war before Clay turns the whole country against you.
Mhm.
So that's a factor. And so in many ways, I guess you could argue that Trist did Polk a solid, because Trist will make sure not only that the insurrection that Scott feared doesn't happen, but also that Clay won't be able to mount a major anti-war movement.
Yeah, in some ways that's true.
So the timing worked out really well for Polk, I would say, even though he didn't see it that way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, actually, no. You say that, I agree. Yeah, no, in the end, Trist actually did him a favor in that regard.
Because I didn't know whether you guys had already mentioned that, because the alternative was effectively a very long guerrilla war that I don't think the Americans win down the line, right?
Yeah, because I mean, if you
Probably
look at
not.
other American guerrilla wars from later periods, like the Philippine War, the Moros War, uh, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, it's not really what America does very well.
No. I mean, in some ways, this is like the 19th century version of the war in Iraq, except for minus the occupation.
Yeah,
But in
except
terms of
and we
the
also got something out of
popularity,
it.
yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
Well, yeah, that's a good point too, because one of the big blessings during this for the Americans is that the Mexican government, the Mexicans are just, they have such political turmoil, and it's hard for them to get that kind of popular insurrection going. And another example of that, by the way, would be 1814 with France when they get invaded.
Hmm.
And Napoleon did try to go like levy en masse, but by that time, Napoleon himself isn't particularly popular in France. So you can't, when you're invaded and your government is weak or weak and or unpopular, it is hard to do that kind of thing where you get a mass uprising going. You know.
Right.
Now it could have, now the insurrection he said Scott was afraid of, very much a fear as the occupation goes on. You know, but
Yeah.
Scott did, but in the approach to Mexico City, Scott masterfully made sure that he was not going to face a mass popular uprising. Um, and I believe that's also one of the absolute keys to his success. But also, it helps once again that the Mexican government by this time is not exactly the most inspiring thing around. You know, I mean, in that regard, there's almost a reason why Napoleon III is going to have a harebrained idea about putting Maximilian there.
Well, yeah, I
Right.
mean,
I was about to say.
inequality in Mexico was crazy. I guess basically,
Yeah,
in many ways, Santa Anna is a caudillo, effectively
Yeah.
a warlord. I mean, and a lot of these
Yeah.
guys, like we've talked about, are effectively warlords who
and yet
happen
that's
to
also
run an
that's the
election
reason.
sometimes.
That's the reason why I mentioned why it was so easy for us to seize New Mexico and California. There weren't that many people there, and the people there, people already there, a lot more already friendly to us. You know, or
Right.
actual Mexicans who were in Texas during the Texas Independence War. They fight with the Texans, not with Santa Anna. They're the kind of people who left because of all that sort of stuff. They were trying to get away from it. You know, a lot of them. So, yeah, that also plays a big part. I mean, there's no way we could win this war with a halfway effective Mexican government opposed to us. You
Yeah.
know,
I think
which
that's right.
which also speaks to the ignorance in Europe. I mean, the Europeans, when they looked at it on paper, of course, taking out Mexico would be difficult. I think it seems to me the Europeans really underestimated uh, the political instability in Mexico. You know, and by the way, it is after this war I've read that's when Europeans really do not take Mexico seriously anymore.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, it makes sense. But
yeah,
it's worth mentioning the importance of battles, frankly, and of historical contingency. Like, it mattered that the United States had competent field commanders.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, and there's a few of the political generals who are considered not to be quite so good. Actually, I'm not a Gideon J. Pillow hater. He's just he's more erratic than anything. He's less incompetent and just more erratic. But one of the reasons that Pillow was so hated was because Pillow and Scott despised each other.
Mm.
And so going into the Civil War, Pillow, of course, already had. I mean, Pillow himself was a bit of a divisive character within Tennessee politics. to begin with. But then Pillow had to serve with a bunch of regular army officers who were like, "We know what you did to Scott. We know what Scott thought of you." And I'm like, I don't think Pillow was really that bad, So even some of the political generals we had weren't terrible. I would say for the Mexicans that Santa Anna actually was not an awful tactician. He actually had some good leader, like battlefield charisma. He was personally brave, and he did do a very good job of raising Mexican armies. But he has too many other problems that handicap him when fighting the Americans.
I want
And
to
I
say
said
he
not
was
a
also.
terrible.
I want to say he was wounded during a lot of this too, if I'm not mistaken.
He had some health problems for sure. Santa Anna, I wasn't a great tactician by any means. I think his biggest problem, which you see at Buena Vista and the Alamo, was his willingness to just do frontal attacks, especially when he knew they had an overwhelming advantage. And yes, Michael, like competent commanders, Taylor, Worth, and Scott are three of the big standouts. But a variety of other officers did very well too. Price, the guy Danafan, the one's name I can never see how to pronounce. I feel kind of tongue tied today, anyway. But anyways, so that's probably because I've been reading all day. But anyways, so yeah, the American commanders here, the core of the commanders are good. As far as the Mexican generals go, outside of Santa Anna, Arista seemed he was all right, kind of average. Amputa was kind of a disgusting pig of a man and a kind of a bit of a psycho. Valencia really wasn't very good either. But it also didn't help that Valencia and Santa Anna were at this point rivals. So Valencia and Santa Anna just were not cooperating with their two forces at Conteras and Churubusco. But anyways, one thing I did want to mention right quick, I forgot to mention one thing about Scott's campaign in Mexico City. It is my opinion that this is the most brilliant campaign ever ever conducted by the American Army, ever. Is the advance from Veracruz to Mexico City.
That sounds about right.
I know of no other achievement that we've done that is just this impressive. And sure, tactically, Molino del Rey was not very well done, and you can make a good case for Churubusco, but you have Chapultepec, the attack on the Mexican city gates, Conteras, Cerro Gordo. This proves that West Point can produce competent professional officers, especially talented engineers. And of course, this war has a big effect on those men who are going to fight in the Civil War. And I did contribute an essay about 12 Civil War generals, 6 Union, 6 Confederate, and how did the war influence them. And there are some historians who say that they don't think it influenced them that much. I highly doubt that. But you can look at their experiences and in the war and see how it's going to influence them later on. And even see like their strengths and weaknesses. Like here's a random one I'll mention. John C. Pemberton. John C. Pemberton did very well during the Mexican War, but he's a staff officer. He was an administrator. He was a guy relaying messages. He was good at that. He was very good at that. He also was good. He wasn't very charismatic personally, but he was a decent social climber. Like he knew who to try to win over, right? And he kind of learned that being a staff officer. But then you look at that influences how he conducts things as a Confederate general defending Vicksburg. In one regard, he was very important for the defense of Vicksburg because when he took it over, the department was in total chaos, and he was able to straighten all that out and create a coherent defense plan for what the Union was doing at the time. But he's ultimately a staff officer, and he's more detached. And when he does finally fight a battle, you got to think about it. This guy did not lead troops in a battle until Champion Hill, where he's commanding an army. And it shows. So I was very proud to be in that group of that essay collection because it's got some great names in there, like Ethan Sepp Refuse and who else? Oh yeah, Timothy B. Smith and a bunch of other ones. So I was very happy to be in there for that reason. But also, yeah, this war definitely had a big effect on the way the Civil War is going to be fought.
Right.
Yeah. So, anyways, that's all I got for you guys. Mexico City campaign, most brilliant. Maybe we'll do a stream just on that to get in the nitty gritty sometime.
It is interesting. I did want to talk about political ramifications because I think those are pretty important here.
Right ahead, man.
I mean, so this will get into like,
Wilmot Proviso.
Oh yeah, yeah. We got to talk. Oh man, yeah. We could get into a lot of details. I know it's already 12, so we should probably not get into too much. But larger political ramifications is this is going to lead to a straight line to the sectional crisis. Straight up. What do you do with these territories? Where is slavery allowed? Where is it not allowed? Um, and it's especially going to lead to this because it is a sort of a massive annexation of Western territory that many Whigs see as illegitimate and illegal. And that's going to affect how they see the state and how they see pro-slavery forces in the 1850s. And this is where you start to get the sort of idea of the sort of gosh, what the slave conspiracy, the slave power conspiracy, rather, that there is a cabal of pro-slavery Southerners who are trying to who are illegally bending the federal government towards pro-slavery policies at any cost, and the goal is to spread slavery throughout the entire United States. And it comes from this war, right? This war is the sort of spark that leads to it. And because you have this huge debate in 1850 over what are you going to do with the territories that were grabbed from this war, and there are pro-slavery Southerners who want to divide Texas up into 6 different states and just dominate the Senate. And eventually, sort of what people come down to is that California is going to be a free state, Texas is going to be a slave state. You're going to keep the same sort of sectional balance, but no one's happy with that. There are Whigs who believe that, who will eventually become Republicans, who believe that slavery should not be expanded into any of these territories. And the Wilmot Proviso is essentially a initiative that is proposed by David Wilmot, who is a fairly unremarkable person who was not particularly known that well at the time, from Pennsylvania, who basically who argues that none of these territories should have slavery legal in them. That they should all be anti-slavery territories, and this makes pro-slavery forces in the United States incredibly angry, because again, this war was fought for sort of 2 reasons. One, manifest destiny, which James K. Polk very much believed in, and saw the taking of California as his legacy of stretching the United States sea to sea. Right, this was fulfilling the goals of manifest destiny. And second, carrying a bunch of territory for slavery to expand into Texas. That was a huge goal of this, and sure enough, cotton plantations are going to, grow substantially in eastern Texas because of this. So it is the pro-slavery ideology becomes substantially more radical out of the Mexican-American War, and you could even argue that you even see it developing within the war itself, as people start to say, let's annex all of Mexico and spread slavery throughout it, right? And anti-slavery sentiment starts to really bubble up because of Henry Clay's turn against the Mexican-American War. And reformists and anti-slavery Whigs really start to become a political force in the country around this time as well. And so this starts to really diverge public sentiment over slavery, which is going to lead to all sorts of problems for the at least problems in terms of the United States arguing over this, of course. It's also going to lead to the Compromise of 1850, which passes the Fugitive Slave Law, which you could argue is the main cause of the Civil War. So it's really this is a sort of a key moment in the development of the U.S. And we can kind of say whether it's good or bad depending on circumstances, right? Like if you think the Civil War was a good thing because it led to the abolition of slavery, well, okay, you can thank James K. Polk for that. But it is that also is traditionally, I saw in the comments some people ask, saying, why is James K. Polk not seen as a great president? The traditional standard of Civil War historiography, which sees the Civil War as a mistake that should have been avoided, is not happy about Polk's decision to invade Mexico because it sets up the circumstances for the sectional crisis, right? So those are some of the political ramifications. Happy to talk about it as much as we want, or if we want to go to super chats, that's fine. But that's pretty. The political ramifications are way more important than the military ones.
Oh yes, well, that's pretty much generally true of the end of any war, I would say.
Yeah.
But then again, what is war but politics by other means? So, no, yes, very much sets up the sectional crisis. Why Polk is not seen as a great president, I think the part two is that historians of this era are a lot of Henry Clay fanboys.
Yes. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, they're Henry Clay fanboys. So, if you are, you're not gonna like Polk. Here's the thing about Polk, though. While he is rated highly as in terms of like he got a lot of stuff, he got most of what he wanted done. He was a very effective president. As far as expanding territory of America, if that's something you view positively, this is a land grab that is comparable to the Louisiana Purchase. And then you're going to have things like the California Gold Rush. And California, of course, has been having a rough period in this century. But I remember at the beginning of this century, California had the fourth biggest economy in the world, like back in 2000. And of course, California's had a big influence on America. And I mean, it's not just California. We got Nevada, Arizona, Utah here, and parts of New Mexico, and then of course parts of Wyoming and Colorado. But the other thing too is this will set up the sectional crisis and that blundering generation theory hypothesis. I am very sympathetic to that one, but as I get older, I have an increasingly low opinion of the political figures during the Civil War, North and South.
Yeah.
My opinion seems to decline every year. And it's almost like doing this, somebody like Polk. And then to be fair, this is the same thing with Franklin Pierce and especially with James Buchanan. There is a kind of blindness to this. Like we have annexed Texas. We're going to secure this land that's ours. Well, we want to fight. So does Mexico. We're going to throw down. And guess what? We'll take these territories of theirs that are in the periphery of their country, filled with people who aren't that happy about them to begin with. And so the temptation is there, not knowing that this is the price that you will pay. But any kind of foresight should have seen it. Because I'm glad you mentioned balance in the Senate. That's an aspect of the origins of the Civil War that does not get talked about enough anymore. I remember hearing a lot more about that when I was younger. But that is a big deal. Balance in the Senate is a big, big deal. Now, at which point the war becomes inevitable. I mean, hell, Summer says Lecompton Constitution. Some will say John Brown. Not getting into that one. But even if a Civil War didn't happen, this is going to create a political firestorm. And it does. It'll consume the country afterwards.
Yeah.
Last thing about the military part for the American military. The American military through this proved itself as a good, competent force with good generals, with good logistics, and we had shown notable improvements from the previous two wars. This war is a much more impressive achievement than the other two. Well, we did much better in them as well. And I would like to note just one last little fun thing on this one. I view the War of 1812 as the first manifest destiny war that's not against an indigenous group. We just happened to lose that one.
Yeah, absolutely. The war to attempt to invade Canada that failed.
That's the main reason. That's the main reason we do it. That is the main reason. Look, the stuff about impressing sailors and some of the insults to us thrown at us by the British. Yes, those didn't help things. But the main reason that war happens is to take Canada. That is the main reason, and we lost.
That's right.
And I actually am the opinion that if you switched it, if Mexico negotiated about Texas and said, okay, we'll settle this, blah, blah, it's taken care of, right? We don't invade Mexico at that point. What if the
No, we don't.
British, on the other hand, go, screw you, we're not getting Oregon, we're going to war. We are invading Canada again.
Yeah.
So, while Mexico is getting more likely target because of the politics and because of James K. Polk's politics, I really do want to figure out at what point was Canada no longer on the menu.
It's very interesting too, because in that scenario where Mexico's willing to give up Texas and Texas is annexed by the US, you're not going to get balance in the Senate. And the thing is it's probably going to end up a much better situation for pro-slavery forces. Because like accepting Texas into the United States would not have nearly created the firestorm that the Mexican-American War does in terms of anti-slavery sentiment.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I agree. I could definitely see that one, But no, just that's all. That's my final thing on that one. You got anything else, guys? Because I remember
don't.
you're in Eastern time. Remember you're in Eastern time zone, so it's past 12 for you all.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
figured we should probably get to super chat. So we could talk a lot. I mean, the consequences of this war are just so massive.
What I'll do is I did want to mention real quick just a few books on the war for people.
Yeah.
That I've read. So let me just go through these right quick. There's one I contributed an essay to, The Mexican-American War Experiences of 12 Civil War Generals. It is very good. He selected some great historians in there. If you're looking for some good first-hand accounts, there is With Beauregard in Mexico, which was edited by T. Harry Williams. It's a much better read than Beauregard's Civil War memoir, which was co-written with Alfred Roman. It's a good read, and it's very accurate, and it's one of the best sources we have on Scott's campaign because Beauregard was so involved in so many battles. If you want to know more about Santa Anna's army, the Osprey book, Santa Anna's Mexican Army by Rene Chartrand, which is for Osprey Publishing. I recommend that one. That's actually one of the best Osprey books of its type I've read because it's short. They give the uniforms, so they really do go into the deficiencies of the Mexican army and why they had so many problems.
Very cool.
One that just came out that I'm writing a review of, I'm very impressed with, is Quartermasters of Conquest. That goes into logistics behind the war and also explains how the American army transformed the border between Texas and Mexico. And so far, I'm very impressed with this book. When they first gave this to me, I was like, oh God, this could be a little bit boring. But I was like, come on, let's take a chance. I'm impressed. This guy's a good writer. He's actually making logistics not a slog to read. So congratulations, Christopher Menking. It's your first book, so far so good. Some good overviews are The Mexican War by Jack Bauer. It's often considered the best one-volume account of the war. I was very impressed with it.
And you could definitely get those in libraries. I actually saw that on the shelf today.
Yeah. So Far from God by John S.D. Eisenhower. I found that to be a good read as well, and that was really good for Taylor's battles in particular. If you want to get into Scott's stuff, though, you do A Gallant Little Army by Timothy D. Johnson. That's about the Mexico City campaign. Excellent book. All right. And last but not least, The War with Mexico, 2 volumes, Justin Harvey Smith. This was published in 1919.
Wow.
It won the Pulitzer at that time. It very much deserved it. This is actually one people still use and still respect. So it's considered. I found out this is actually considered one of the best. One of the best military histories written in that time and still holds up. And I did use this as a source. It was good.
That's impressive.
And yes, since historians of this war still lean on this one. Yeah, I know. Because a lot of these old history books they start getting forgotten a lot of times. A lot of times I'd say unfortunately, but this one has not. This one still has a high rep. Huh. So The War of Mexico, 2 volumes. I can recommend that. And that's all I got for the recommendations. So let's do some super chats.
One I would recommend that both Thersites and I read was A Wicked War by Amy Greenberg. That's a more accessible account. It gives the war through the eyes of Polk, Nicholas Trist, Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln. So it's if you want to learn more about those figures, it's pretty interesting.
And then Hardin, of course, too.
Oh yeah, I forgot about Hardin. Yeah. Good
John J. Hardin, who is kind of like this figure who was the coming man in American politics, and he gets killed at Buena Vista.
Man, there's somebody else like that too. Yeah, there's actually, I think about this sometimes with some of the Warren, who died at Bunker Hill.
Mm.
I mean, he was highly, highly respected. That man would have been very much involved in the Revolutionary War's politics. I wouldn't say he'd be a household name per se, but I mean, he was one of the prominent political leaders, and he dies at Bunker Hill.
Oh wow.
Oh man.
Yeah. Yeah. So, anyways,
all right.
Interesting enough, though. Interesting enough about Warren, though, he was actually technically supposed to be in charge there, but he deferred to the other guys because he's like, "Hey, you know more than I do."
Interesting.
Anyways, yeah. So, anyway, guys, super chats.
Yeah, let's do it.
So our first one of the evening comes to us from Tanner Mullins for 1999. Thank you, Tanner. He says, "Hey guys, long-time listener, first-time super chatter. This is a game recommendation for anybody who is interested in the Civil War. We got Ultimate General Civil War, Grand Tactician, and War of Rights. Love y'all boys." Are you familiar with any of those games, Sean?
I've heard of them, and I think I've got. I think I might have War of Rights, but I just don't. I just don't play video games as much anymore. Although there's this one I wanted to give a shot recently that's called like Task Force Admiral, where you like manage your carrier force in in the Pacific. Yeah, I think I might do that one because I've always wanted to have like some like advanced carrier game where you gotta like decide your cap and almost like micromanage your ship, but
So like
no, I
Hearts of Iron for ships.
I guess Cross of Iron. I'm sorry, Hearts of Iron to me is just goofy though.
Well, it's also a lot of micromanaging. It's like a game James Polk would enjoy.
Yeah,
that's true, actually.
Yeah, that's almost like Gary Grisby's games were like that too. I've always like kind of wanted to do those, but man, it's a hell of a time sink, Also, in the case of Hearts of Iron, I think the thing that got me is that like I know you can slow things down, but I prefer turn-based for that stuff.
Same.
Yeah.
That kind of the pacing in that game just gets to me,
All right. So what's your next?
Next, we have Napoleon the Great for $5. Thank you, Napoleon. He says, "I've been reading up on the 30 Years' War recently. Any chance for a stream on that?" Well,
no.
Why not?
You don't have to do it.
Dude, all right, yeah, okay, not me. Get somebody else. Every time I try to read about that war, I'm lost.
I would love to talk about the Great Swedish Empire of the 1600s. So yes,
Yeah, and
I am down for this.
Yeah, because
I can do. My compromise is I'll do an English Civil War stream sometime because I'm really into that one.
Okay, yeah, so I can do either of those topics. I taught classes last semester that deal with both, with the 30 Years' War and the English Civil War. So I've got some familiarity, and then I could read up on it a bit more. But yeah, I mean, I would be totally down for that. It's a very fascinating topic. Also, how the Protestant-Catholic rivalry took 100 years to get to this point. And the reasons for that are also interesting. Hint, it's the Ottomans.
Kills a third of the German population, by the way.
Yeah.
Hugely important war to understand Europe.
Although I think most modern estimates think that number has been pretty wildly exaggerated.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean,
it's still fucking bad, though.
It's still really fucking bad, don't get me wrong, but it's not a third. Probably the reason why they came up with that number is because they weren't counting people who were dislocated. They were assuming anybody who's dislocated was dead.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But still, there's that one for 30 Years' War is like its effect. I'm pretty good on that one. But the actual course of the war, it's so Sorry, it's just been like every time I've tried to crack it, it hasn't worked yet.
Oh, it's insane.
Well,
You have people leaving the war, entering the war. I mean, that's why it lasts so long.
Well, maybe with that one,
Yeah.
if we do it, we could break it up into multiple parts, like figure out phases of the war and just do, phase 1, 2, 3, whatever.
You probably would want to, yeah.
Yeah, so that'd probably be the way to go about that.
And then throw in the English Civil War in there since they're concurrent. At least the last phase is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Actually,
All
I looked
right.
up my reviews of 30 Years War books. I gave one 4 stars, one 3, and then one of them 1 star.
Woo.
Anyway,
Man.
go ahead, man.
All right, our next one is from Hose and Oz for $4.99. Thank you, Hose and Oz. He says, "Old Rough and Ready, Old Fuss and Feathers. They had aura, not gonna lie. Those are dope nicknames."
Yeah.
Wait, what was the name again? Sorry.
Old Rough and Ready, and then Old Fuss and Feathers.
Oh yeah, old Fuss and Feathers, man. That tells you a lot about Scott there, you know.
Yeah, it's an interesting nickname. I'm not sure that one is. I mean, it's memorable, which is good, but I'm not sure I'd want to be known as Old Fuss and Feathers.
What about General Meade? You could be a googly-eyed snapping turtle.
That's pretty bad, but it's kind of funny though. So
Well, we know that because some doctor goes up to Meade and says, "Hey, I just got insulted. The soldiers called me old pills." He said, "Well, what of it? Somebody just called me a googly-eyed old snapping turtle." Thank you, Meade.
yeah.
All right. What's
Um.
next?
All right. Next, we have another from Hose and Oz for $4.99. Thank you, Hose and Oz. He says, "I'm pretty sure that Polk achieved more of his campaign promises than any other U.S. president."
Yeah.
Probably so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is why we got into that question about effectiveness. I mean, I briefly saw your comment earlier. And yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Sean. Like, regardless, the disagreement about Polk is whether what he did was good or not, but he effectively did it. Like, there's no question about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Like-
I know. I saw another comment by Hose and Oz, not a super chat, but something about he thinks that the reason why Polk is never considered top 5 is because of he called it wokeness, but I don't think Polk was ever considered top 5.
No.
At least once those
I think-
lists started.
That's what I was gonna say. I think maybe he was in 1870 or something.
Yeah, when we only had like 17 presidents.
You also got to
Yeah.
keep in mind too. I think Polk, the blundering generation people, the blundering generation thesis, which was very big, say 80, 90 years ago, they didn't hold Polk in high regard. From what I've read, Polk was held in better regard after the Civil War because by that time it's like, man, we are now pushing west. Like
Yeah.
so. I guess what I'm saying is just the amount of territory that Polk took, and I always say that it's no surprise that when the frontier is declared over in 1890 and Frederick Jackson Turner does this whole thing, less than 10 years later, we're already attacking another country to take their land.
That's right.
We
And
are
I think-
Americans. That's what we do.
I think Polk is actually a really great lesson in that it's not just a matter about what objectives you accomplish. It matters how you accomplish those objectives, right? Because this war fuels what I would argue are some of the worst sort of impulses of the United States in terms of militarism, in terms of pro-slavery ideology, in terms of racism, that come back to bite the United States down the line, right?
Yeah. Now, if we're talking about if Polk should be top 5 just in terms of pure impact, I would agree.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if we're just saying pure effectiveness, yes. But once we get into morality and good and bad, the fact that he accomplished his goals in ways that empowered the worst people in U.S. history, I think is matters, right?
Well, I don't know if he empowered the worst people. I think in some ways, though, it's inevitable. I think this is all baked in the cake. And, You mentioned the pro-slavery ideology. I actually put the pro-slavery ideology under a greater umbrella of the business of America as business.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh yeah,
yeah.
if slavery wasn't profitable, they would have ended slavery immediately.
No, I mean that's true. Yeah, and that's
I,
something that a lot of historians have shown over the past 2 decades, that basically refuting this whole thing that, oh, slavery was an unprofitable system. No, it was incredibly profitable. It was
yeah.
ridiculously profitable.
In fact, to put it this way too, when there were people in the South more forcefully advocating for abolition of slavery, when people were freeing their slaves in the late 1700s, was when slavery was looking like it wasn't profitable anymore.
That's
And
right.
then cotton gin and sugar in Louisiana, and wham bam, you're right back at it. And how long slavery would have persisted if the Confederacy had won? Open debate, because you've also got to consider international pressures with that as well. Is
Yeah.
consider Brazil for one thing. But all that being said, the fact that it's gonna go on as long as it does, and you have a war, a lot of it is because they're making a lot of money off this stuff. And I believe that the persistence of slavery in America is a manifestation of America's obsession with profit, money. I forget who it was, but there's somebody said that America is an experiment in letting sociopaths run a country. And people go like, well, only recently or something. Like, no, I think since Jamestown. But that's my take.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's actually an opinion that many white Northerners would have around the time of the Civil War.
Yeah, but also I would throw the same thing to them as well, because America's first true genocidal war is the Pequot War, which is
Yeah.
also I view it's something too, like the ones up in Massachusetts are sociopaths of a different color, but the Pequot War to me is one of the decisive moments in American history nobody talks about, because the Jamestown stuff wasn't purely genocidal. It was, it was just the kind of fight you're going to have when two groups are going to be disputing some land. The Pequot War is straight up just murder.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The Pequot
Yeah.
War looks ahead to a lot of the crazy shit that happens in the 1800s.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
right.
So anyway, there we go, guys. Dark opinions in America. Keep going.
Yeah, so,
All right. Joe Mama for $5. Thank you, Joe Mama. He says, Thersites the historian. Would you rather be a Carthaginian at Cannae or a Turk at Manzikert? Easy question, actually. I'd rather be a Turk at Manzikert. The reason is, even though the Carthaginians won at Cannae, they actually do suffer fairly substantial casualties, one. And then two, there's not really a big follow-up of the victory in Cannae. So none of those guys went on to have big estates in Italy or anything like that. Capua would defect, and then, of course, Macedon joins the war. But obviously, they did not fully capture the momentum, and they started losing again within a few years. Whereas at Manzikert, the Turks then go on to overrun the entirety of Asia Minor, and many of them will pick up a lot of land. Byzantium will be more or less out of commission for a couple decades until the First Crusade. So I'd have to choose Manzikert just because the aftermath is so much better for the victor.
Cool question.
Yeah, interesting one. All right. And MC Maestro, $50. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you, MC Maestro. Try to do that. Michael R for $5. I love your military history coverage. Why do you think Polk is never heralded as a top 5 president considering all the land he acquired? And I guess we've pretty much talked about that.
yeah, we pretty much answered that. So
Yeah,
I will say
I,
though, if you are to manifest destiny, he is the greatest man who ever lived.
yeah.
it,
Well, I guess by that criteria though, who would be better, him or Thomas Jefferson?
Jefferson.
Well, no, I think Polk got more territory, didn't he?
Maybe, but the securing the Mississippi was way more important for the economy of the United States.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point there. Yeah, yeah. Also, was acquired. I say acquired much more cheaply. I mean, you still have to go go
Yeah.
and fight. I mean, Little Bighorn happens with the Louisiana in Louisiana Purchase territory.
And this is where the how you get something matters, right? Like getting Louisiana Purchase with the way Jefferson got it united the country as opposed to divided it, which by definition makes from pure national self-interest makes the United States stronger.
Yes. Yeah, I guess so. I want to look into that. I wonder how the Federalists felt about Louisiana Purchase. I've got a few books in Louisiana Purchase that I haven't delved into yet. You know, that could be something good for the future.
So I guess
You know,
sometimes we should do like an imperialist presidential ranking, and then it's basically there are only two competitors for that top spot. There's Jefferson, Polk, and then just a bunch of trash. And maybe I guess McKinley's like top 5.
Yeah.
TR.
Hey. Pierce did the Gadsden Purchase. All right, just throwing that out there.
Johnson got Alaska.
Oh yeah, you're right. Andrew Johnson would actually be in a top 5 list for a change. So there you go.
I mean,
It'd be the weirdest list of all time.
I mean, to be honest.
Also Tyler, because Tyler gets Texas.
Oh.
Does the annexation, but also Tyler does settlements with Britain to secure the border, which, if you look at it from the pro-British point of view, we got some land from that.
Okay, so our top 5 would be Jefferson, Polk, and then I'm guessing who would the top 5 be? Jefferson, Polk.
So I would actually argue. So I'm gonna just go like curveball completely. Top 5. The top is actually FDR.
I was thinking that too.
For reasons that, if you look at the creation of the post-war order, Bretton Woods, and I mean, he did the 20th century version of effectively like taking over vast portions of the world.
Oh yeah, and I guess he also builds the fleet pretty much, and the Air Force, what becomes the Air Force. The origins of all that are in the 30s.
Charter.
Yeah,
the Atlantic Charter as well, which essentially says Britain, you'll not have an empire.
Yeah. No, I guess we're going like with the soft empire, then FDR would be the top guy.
Oh, you say that, but I think that empire got put in through iron as well, just by different means.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Like, if we're doing like the purely imperialist ranking, I think we've got to go with people who just go in and fucking seize stuff, and then claim that that God told them to do it. So
it was only tongue in cheek, I would say. Yeah.
Oh no, actually, I think FDR is the top imperial president. I actually already thought that.
Well, maybe.
Because you got to think about Franklin Roosevelt. His imagination for how the world was going to be was massive, expansive, and was carried out. There's a reason why he is, the only presidents who can possibly compete with him in consequence are Washington and Lincoln, and actually, I don't think Lincoln can. I put FDR more important than Lincoln in influence. But
yeah, I agree.
Because the thing about Lincoln, I still go back on this. I think the most important thing that happened in Lincoln's presidency for Lincoln was him getting shot. He's a divisive figure throughout his presidency. I just read about how he was not popular in Britain at all because of the tariffs he put in. So even people in Britain who wanted the Union to win would say, I really don't like Lincoln, though. And they also really didn't like William Seward in Britain. So, I'm just saying, like Lincoln dies and then he just becomes Jesus. But somebody else could have won that war. Would they have done better or worse? I don't know. Lincoln had his advantages. He was really good at those political connections, and forging alliances and keeping some people happy. But keeping some people happy, those radicals sure as hell weren't happy. That's why there's an entire book in the 1864 election that just says, decide on the battlefield. It wasn't Lincoln's political brilliance that got him reelected. It was Sherman.
Right.
Yeah,
which is doubly funny because Sherman, by the way, throughout 1864 ignores orders from Lincoln. Which is why, one of the reasons why when Sherman reaches Savannah, Edwin Stanton comes there to check on him and essentially scold him, but in a somewhat respectful way because he's a successful general. But Lincoln was giving him orders like about black recruitment for the USCT, and he just take the paper and throw it behind him. He doesn't care. He thought Lincoln was a joke until he thought Lincoln was pretty much a joke until the very end of the war. So the guy who secures the presidency is a man who doesn't even like him.
Well, I mean, you could also make the case that Trist secured Polk's legacy by ending the war when he did and how he did. And obviously, Polk and Trist are not best buddies.
Yeah, that's good. No, that's a good point. That also makes Trist and Sherman very interesting, considering that they at the end are doing a favor for somebody they don't like. But in the case of Lincoln, Lincoln was never like, "Oh, Sherman sucks." Lincoln was like, "Well, he's doing all right. I'm a bit annoyed he's not like following some of my orders, but at least he's advancing."
Yeah. I'm going to do a quick defense of Lincoln. He navigated some pretty difficult things in the Civil War in politically adept ways that also upheld the sort of morality of the country. And I think, emancipation as a war measure was clever and worked.
Yes.
Handling
slavery is very clever. Very, very, very shrewd. Very well done.
And straight up, fundamentally changed the United States. It changed the United States in terms of giving the U.S. a different, I would argue in some ways, a different founding. A different sort of moral goal to strive for. Which, is important. Now,
I guess I give more credit to that founding to what Congress does after the war than I give to Lincoln himself.
It's a little bit of both. Yeah, I agree. It's tough to disentangle it.
It's tough to disentangle, but there's also like reading about Lincoln's ideas on Reconstruction, how they're carrying out in Louisiana. The radicals are howling about what he's doing.
That's true. Yeah.
That's why I'm always like, Lincoln's so lucky he got shot, because if he really was intent on the kind of Reconstruction he wanted, what are they going to do? Impeach him? I mean, I'm not saying they would do that, but I think Lincoln Lincoln got hit with one bullet, but dodged another, if you ask me.
And he was moving on the question, but the question is how fast would he have moved, and would he have been effective post-war? And I'm not sure.
Also, I do want to throw one other interesting one to you right now. I'm reading this excellent book called The Civil War and the Age of Nationalism. This book is one of the best Civil War books I've read in years. Poking a lot of holes and things, putting the Civil War in international context, something I've always wanted to see. But they have an entire section of the book comparing Lincoln to Cromwell.
Very interesting.
And they line up so well in a number of things. And he made one point in particular. He said, for the period, Cromwell actually wasn't very cruel to enemies he defeated, especially compared with people in the 30 Years' War. Unless you're Irish. Then he says Lincoln was magnanimous in so many ways to the defeated South, more than to the South throughout the war, more so than most civil wars are handled. Most civil wars are much more, much. The Union Army compared to a lot of other civil wars is relatively kindly, okay? And he also says, and the same thing, like he's advancing on the topic of slavery. He never liked slavery to begin with, but he's very careful about how he advances on it. And yes, I do agree that is one thing that he politically handled very well. However, then he makes the point, unless you're an indigenous person, Lincoln has no time for you at all.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
And by the way, Lincoln also would crack jokes about how stupid it would be if women ever got the right to vote. Just another fun one. Yeah, which apparently really annoyed... I think John C. Fremont's he made a joke about women having political opinions to John C. Fremont's wife when she visited him. So he's a man of his time. I know that phrase is overused, but I mean, what are you going to expect from him? But I guess what I'm saying is that, I don't know how Lincoln would have handled Reconstruction. Those who say that he definitely would have gone the Andrew Johnson way, I'm not sure. He was a flexible man, right? He was intelligent. But at the same time, I can tell in his heart of hearts, he's not a radical. Yeah. There's a reason that they're annoyed with him.
He's a constitutionalist.
What'd you say?
He's a constitutionalist.
Perhaps. I think he's a lawyer first and foremost.
Yeah.
Which is the same thing. At least.
No. Lawyers are more slippery. I think the last constitutionalist president was James Madison.
Well, all right.
Anyway,
Interesting.
We should move on.
All
Hey,
right.
hey, I mean, look, Lincoln putting guys in jail just for voicing opinions, not my cup of tea. Not my cup of
Right.
tea.
Like, also, I'm convinced John Adams needs to be moved down the presidential rankings. The more I learn about him, the less I respect him. He was a thin-skinned little tyrant.
uh, I like a lot of things about John Adams, but you're right. He did get puffed up a lot in the 2000s. Every decade chooses who their founding father is, and that was the one for the aughts.
Well, I
Yeah,
mean, I guess it makes sense that in the Bush era he would be puffed up because, John Adams was, for all intents and purposes, a big government conservative.
Yeah, in many ways.
I
I
mean,
think
for,
John Adams is really. I think John Adams, though, one thing I'd say about him is he is has a political thinker. He's one of the more interesting ones of the era.
yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
very intelligent.
Jefferson is, yeah, very, very intelligent. And the one question I'd have for John Adams, if I ever did meet him, is why did you have so many copies of Rousseau's The Social Contract with parts underlined? You probably
That's a
was
really good question.
he
Well,
never really wrote much about it. When there's personal library, they're like he had several well-worn copies with passages underlined. And I also wonder if there's any notes in there too, because for instance, I was able to get a copy of uh, Sherman did some annotations on Grant's memoirs where he wrote a few notes of his own. I was able to get like some copies of that to look
yeah.
at, for evidence. And I'd just be fascinated, like, what if did he have little notes that he wrote and we just lost them or something?
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, for me, the question, if I could ask either Jefferson or Adams, it'd be like, so, because I forget which one of them accused the other of being a pedophile, which one called the other one a hermaphrodite. But I'm especially curious about the one who used the hermaphrodite line, because I'm wondering, how effective do you think it would be if you accuse somebody of being something, you have to explain what it is?
Uh,
Because most people
I
don't know what a
think
hermaphrodite
Jefferson.
is.
One thing I think Jefferson's people called Adams a hermaphrodite. I remember Adams people though said that if Thomas Jefferson was elected, there'd be a guillotine in every city in America.
Yep.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
glad he never got elected then, because that would have been bad. But, yeah. Anyway, oiled and lubed phalanx for $4.99. Thank you, oiled and lubed
Whoa,
phalanx. That's an interesting name.
good name.
A
Good name.
moment of
That's funny.
silence for the unlucky others, but a gratitude for me for being able to make it to the long teased Mexican American War live stream. I'm glad you could make it, oiled and lubed phalanx. Hopefully, all of the members of your group were moving smoothly and without a lot of clanking. All right, we have Tasmanian Walrus for $5. Thank you. And he says, Cerro Gordo is this war's equivalent of Fisher Hill. What do you think is the more impressive campaign, Scott's Mexico City campaign or Vicksburg?
Yeah, that's a good analogy for Cerro Gordo with Fisher Hill. Of course, I'm going to say Scott on this one, but Grant Vicksburg is top 10 for America, easy, maybe top 5.
Hmm.
And for the American Civil War, it might be the best campaign. Might be. I want to think about that. It's easily a top 5, though.
What I have
Definitely
to
Grant's
ask,
5.
what I have to ask Sean, based on the observation I have of your thought and how it evolves over time, do you think that when you study stuff specifically that you have the kind of familiarity breeds contempt approach to things, or that like the more you study
What do you,
something, the less impressed you are by it in general?
no, I think no. Well, okay. Uh, no. The more I studied the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, the more impressed I got.
Hmm.
Uh, in the case of the Civil War, it may sound like I'm less impressed by things, but I'm going to go back what Shelby Foote said. He said, "We fought that war, so of course that'd be the greatest war ever, the greatest generals ever, and they're all brilliant geniuses." And I think that was the problem: is the American Civil War, the political actors and the generals got puffed up beyond what they were actually doing. And I mentioned stuff with Lincoln. I can be very critical of Lincoln, but yes, he was very politically capable, good at those alliances and connections. And Michael is absolutely correct. The way he handles the slavery issue in the war is expert level. And he does have a big effect on things, for sure. But however, the idea that it could not have been done without Lincoln, no, it could have been done without Lincoln.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, that's
I
all.
do agree with that.
However, I'll tell you this: in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, I feel he is more indispensable and leaving more of his mark. You
Yes.
know, God, the Atlantic Charter, that's an underrated moment in history for as far as I'm concerned. Maybe not to the experts in the field. People don't talk enough about it, but I mean, he's literally just telling Winston Churchill, he's like, "Look, we're going to dismantle the British Empire if we win." You know that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also,
Yeah.
I
I mean,
always find it interesting, when people talk about the iconic leaders of World War II, they talk about FDR and Churchill as if they're on an equal footing. But I can't help but think that FDR was a couple rungs at least above Churchill in terms of importance.
It's not even
that's one,
close.
that's one for you. That's one for you. Franklin Roosevelt's another person. The more I read about and study, the more impressed I am. He had his faults too. He didn't really understand the Soviets. He really was naive about them until like the last month he was alive, and by that time it's too late. But I don't want to get into there's a whole lot of other ins and outs with that, but overall I'm more impressed, say, with him, or as probably all your listeners know, Richard Nixon.
I mean, just to say, so it's 2025, so we're 80 years off from, you know, Roosevelt's death.
Yeah.
And it's notable that the opposition political party to Roosevelt has spent 80 years trying to undo everything he's done, and mostly failing.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had much more success against the Great Society.
Yeah.
But yeah, so no, I think that's all it is with the Civil War. Is it just got pumped up too much, you know.
Mhm.
Also the last thing on that one too, which is why I'm really loving this Civil War and the Age of Nationalism. A lot of American history gets very colloquial, very um, almost navel gazing, and the American Civil War in particular. I read this one book on the siege of Spanish Fort, and it's a good book. It's really good. The only thing that got it to me is when the person said the siege of Spanish Fort in 1865 really looks to World War One. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It's like any other siege from the era.
Oh my
You'd have to
God.
you'd have to. But in other words, nothing. No, the guy wrote a good account of the siege, and he made actually reading about the siege kind of
Oh, sure,
interesting.
I'm sure.
Congratulations, right? But the siege of Spanish Fort in 1865 outside of Mobile is not unique or special. It's not pointing towards World War One.
Right.
But American historians they don't reading about the Napoleonic Wars really made me rethink a lot of the ways that I think about the American Civil War militarily. You know,
Yeah.
and it's
American historians need to read in comparative perspectives, frankly. And I
yes,
mean, that's something my dissertation has very much burned into my brain.
excellent, man, 100%. That's the way to go. We got to get out of these narrow confines, where everybody thinks Grant and Lee were geniuses. And I'm like, no, they were talented, but they ain't Wellington. They're not, they're not even Maurice de Saxe.
When you see the Russians and the Americans doing almost the exact same things in the exact same place, it really changes your perspective about national exceptionality.
Right. I mean,
God,
because
man.
there's only so many ways you can colonize a place, and I guess people will think
Mhm.
of the same obvious ways to do it.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll even make the exact same mistakes. So yeah, I 100% with you, Sean, on that. That sounds like a really interesting book.
Yeah, no, dude, and also it's a really good read as well. It's very thought provoking, and also he's one of those guys who he'll say okay, so people for instance, a bunch of he's looking at European liberals, and he says a lot of people say the liberals in Europe were all pro union. He's like, no, they weren't. They're actually kind of split because a bunch of them were pro Confederate. They would always say they didn't like slavery, but they believed in national self determination.
Mm.
Liberals who backed the Confederacy in Europe, that's why they backed the Confederacy, because they viewed the
Right.
federal government as being tyrannical and stopping a rebellion by people who wanted to govern themselves. So these are the same people who were supporting the Hungarian rebellion at the same time. Or the Hungarian rebellion that happened before. Stuff like that, And meanwhile, there are other liberals, of course, who are very pro-union. And however, if you're more aligned with socialism, you're always pro-union
Yep,
in the war.
that's right.
Yeah. So, so that's the thing the author says is that he's like liberals and socialists are not the same thing, and I'm like, no, they're not. they share some similarities, but I mean, hell, I mean, so do Nazis and communists. I mean, whatever, they're people, you know. But anyway, that's why I'm saying this book is a great read. I can recommend to everybody. I'm only 100 pages in, but I can't see this book getting bad. All right.
Hmm.
Anyways, I'm done.
All right. Now we have Leb for $5. Thank you, Leb. He says, off topic. Ever thought about doing a stream about the early church / Gnosticism, like ranking the Nag Hammadi text? P.S. Opinion on Gnosticism in general. That is something I actually have thought about, but not as a ranking stream. It would be one where I might read one of the Gnostic Gospels, and then just kind of discuss it, or go through it systematically, because I think these are things that often intimidate readers because of their reputation. And some of these are very abstruse. Like, some of them are so abstruse that I forget the professor's name, but there was a famous professor from the 70s, and I knew somebody who took a class with him. And they said that he had the class read different Gnostic Gospels, and he asked one of the students to explain it. And at the end of the student's explanation, he said, "Why, I'd like to congratulate you doing an excellent job. I'll be honest, I have no idea what the hell this is or what it's about." And this is one of the most famous professors at the time in the field. And he's saying, like, I don't understand this text. So imagine being at a fairly major school, I think it was like UC Berkeley or somewhere, and you've got an internationally famous scholar saying, "Yeah, here's a text in my field that I do not get."
Wow.
So that's been common for a lot of the Gnostic Gospels, although there are some that are not as abstruse. And the other thing to keep in mind with the Gnostic Gospels is that many of them assume that you're already trained in a tradition before you read it, or you have guidance while reading it. So there's a reason why these didn't become prominent, or didn't get preserved in the New Testament. It's because they're difficult. Whereas the New Testament text is written at about a 6th grade level. So it's not very hard to figure out.
Also, a lot of the New Testament is letters, right? I would say this from having read the Bible, the Book of John, you can feel the influence of Gnosticism in that book.
You can also feel a touch of Plato there.
Yes, definitely, definitely, and also you can see that in some of the later Old Testament stuff as well. Yeah. So, so no, you can feel the influences of Greek philosophy of Platonism. Yeah.
Yeah,
That man,
like
that'd
the
be that's a stream I
Hellenistic.
would probably just listen. That's a stream I'd probably just listen to. I'm agnostic on the
Yeah, I mean, so Gnosticism
bother
is a very
arguing about it quite a bit.
yeah, Gnosticism's a very complex topic. I do have a friend who studies early Christianity. I don't know if he's looked much into Gnostics, but I would try to rope him in for that if I could. It would be difficult because he's pretty busy. He's like a tenure track professor at Penn State, so. But anyway, we'll look into that in the future, maybe. I'll have a lot of time this summer. We'll see. Arjun Jairaj, $2. Thank you, Arjun. He said, "Thanks for explaining why Baja isn't U.S. land. Hoorah." Well, I also didn't know about all the assaults on Baja California, but I guess it makes sense if, American forces failed to take it and then Trist was not motivated to acquire it. So, I also did not know that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I learned a lot reading for the stream, so it was interesting.
Yeah. Then I believe our last super chat of the evening comes from Mark Benevento for $9.99. Thank you, Mark. Where would America be today if we never fought this war? Well, that is a good question.
Yeah, and I think we talked about it a little bit. I mean, I think you're gonna have a situation where slavery stays more as a dormant issue in American history, right? Or at least not in American history, in the 1840s rather, in the 1850s as well. And that has consequences, right? The interesting thing is, if this war even just gets delayed,
It just
it's
gets delayed. That's what I think.
yeah, but if it gets delayed, gold is discovered. And how does that change the dynamics, right? That gives a strong incentive for Americans to try to take California from Mexico.
And it gives the
Uh,
Mexicans an incentive to maybe have an army deployed there.
uh-huh. So I think it fundamentally changes some things.
Yeah.
Good point on the gold. Yeah.
I do think it pushes back a potential civil war in U.S. history. I think a lot of the ways that the Mexican-American War went down really created a sectional crisis. Like if you do not get that fugitive slave law, you don't get a huge anti-slavery movement. It's the federal government going into northern communities that leads to not only the anti-slavery movement, but also leads to Uncle Tom's Cabin, leads to a whole cultural moment. So
Right.
yeah, so it has some fairly significant impacts on U.S. domestic politics. I don't think it changes Mexican history that much because, frankly, I don't think Mexico holds on to those territories. There aren't enough people there, simply put.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What
there
if
might be though.
what if
California
independent?
gold rush. There might be. Of course, then there might
It,
be a bunch of Americans making it over there faster than the Mexicans.
Yeah. What if
that's
it's
what I would
just
think.
a Bear Flag Republic, and then you have the Texas Republic, and then the U.S. doesn't take those, and they remain independent.
I think
Yeah,
if eventually the U.S. does take them through annexation, it might just take longer.
I don't know about in the case of California. Maybe we don't get it, or at least, or we have to go through. I think maybe probably through a bloodier war. You're finding gold over there. But all that being said, I don't want to comment on how that would influence Mexico, simply because Mexican history is a big blind spot for me. I know about it only in sections like this one, and even this one, I confess the much like the 30 Years' War, a lot of the political connections and infighting can sometimes leave me a bit dizzy.
Yeah, I mean,
So I don't make a comment. I don't want to make a comment on Mexico. I think you're right about delaying the Civil War, but the real question is gold found at the time that it's found, and what effect does it have on Mexico? The Mexicans flood in there. Um,
I,
they have an army deployed there, or do our settlers get there in such large numbers that California detaches?
I
You
would
know,
bank on the latter simply because Mexico doesn't have a history of engaging in significant settler colonialism. And that matters, right?
that's a good point. Yeah.
Like, even if California gets more populous, are they going to be able to sustain the waves of American settlers that are going to come there? Probably not.
Do you know, I'm gonna say this one too. A bigger what if for me is, what if the Mexicans win San Jacinto? What if
that's a
the
that's a better
Texas
what if.
Texas independence is just snuffed out right then and there? That's one I would really consider. But anyways, what's our next one, guys?
That is it. We're done.
All
All
right,
right.
congrats everybody, another stream down.
Yep.
Yeah, this was a
Thank
good
you
one
all,
though. I
guys. Thank
appreciate
you
it.
all. Yeah.
Yeah, for
Any
sure.
chance to talk about any chance to talk about Scott marching on Mexico City? So no, that's pretty much it. Thank y'all.
Yeah, that was good. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. We'll be announcing more stuff going forward, and yeah, I don't really have much by the way of outro tonight. I'm just kind of worried about how this stream will close off because I've been having technical issues with most streams that run longer than 3 hours for some reason. It's some sort of weird YouTube thing.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Can't announce anything, but look, I think Thersites and I are looking at some potential streams in the next couple of months to do some fun series. So stay tuned.
yeah.
All
So
right, guys.
we'll have announcements about stuff and things. All right, so that's it. Good night, everybody. I'm gonna try to end the stream now, and hopefully, it will comply.